Hey everyone, and welcome to another video. So today I'm going to be breaking down each and every rune in the game, row by row, tree by tree, really getting into the details so we can understand the main strengths. What are the main weaknesses? When should you opt in for this rune? When should you avoid this rune? What sort of champions actually take this rune, and how does it influence the way they play trades, the way they play the lane, the way they actually win the game? And that actually ties into the main reason I wanted to do this video, is because I've seen in the community a ridiculous amount of players who blindly follow rune pages that they found on either pro builds or Mobifier guides or some random YouTube video or some stream. And if you don't understand how they actually work and how it influences the way you play trades or win the game or play that specific matchup, then you're going to find yourself getting into very sticky situations, and overall you're just going to not maximize the chances of winning the game. Now, this is a very important skill set to have, especially if you want to improve and climb over the long run. And hopefully, my goal by the end of this video, you're going to be able to create your own rune pages, theorycraft, come up with a rune page that suits you, the way you interpret that specific matchup. Now, this was going to be one giant video tied together with itemization, but I realized that's a little over the top, so I split it into two. It's a two-part video. The first one's just runes. The second one's going to be all about itemization. And yes, this is going to be through the lens of a mid laner, so I'm always going to try to tie it back to specific mid champions and what you would need to know as a mid laner. But again, I'm going to be as objective as possible, and there's certain runes that you have to talk about in terms of a top laner or a support or an AD carry, so I will do that at times throughout this video. So without further ado, let's dive straight in, guys. Let's go ahead and break down what we're going to be covering within this video. So the first thing, I'm just going to quickly talk about the purpose of rune and itemization optimization. Then I'm going to go ahead and break down each and every row of runes, talk about the strengths, the weaknesses, when to take it, etc. Then I'm going to cover some common rune mistakes, very, very important for every single one of you watching this video. Number 4, how to actually adapt runes for each game. So given I'm playing Orianna into a certain matchup, if I change that matchup, add a few different junglers in there, what is my thought process and what do I actually change and why? And then lastly, I'm going to go ahead and actually create a rune page from scratch. Literally, if I was to create a random rune page for a specific champion, applying these fundamentals that we spoke about within this video. So let's quickly talk about why runes and itemization are so incredibly important. So the way I like to view runes and itemization is that they're simply a means to help you win a game in the most effective and efficient way possible. Therefore, runes and itemization must be directly tied to both two things: your champion's identity, and be able to adapt to the specific variables within each game. Even if you know your champion's identity to a T, if you're not willing to adapt given the changes in opponent, given the changes in the meta, the way you think that game pace is specifically going to play out, then you're really not going to be maximizing your chances of winning. Now, to really get this point across, I want to use an analogy for a second, and I really like the MMA analogy. So for those of you who aren't really familiar with MMA, it's just mixed martial arts, two people fighting, and the way it actually works is that sometimes you get one fighter who's a specialist in a specific craft or a specific field. So maybe you get one guy who's really, really good at boxing, and then you get one guy who's really, really good at wrestling or jiu-jitsu or whatever other specific niche craft that they're really, really good at, because they come from different backgrounds. So what happens when a fighter finds out who they're versing, they try to watch their VODs and really understand how that person navigates a fight. Then what happens in turn is that they actually change their training regime, and they actually change maybe which muscles they want to train a little bit more. Maybe they change the strategy that they're going to go about to actually win that matchup. So for those of you who do understand a bit of MMA, there was a fight where it was Conor McGregor versus Nate Diaz. The first fight he was in, he didn't do too well, and then the second fight he actually won. He adapted his strategy, and he actually realized that he couldn't just trade punches with this guy. He actually had to go for leg kicks. So he actually traded leg kicks with this guy and actually demolished his leg and eventually won that fight. The same thing with Floyd Mayweather. In boxing, he has a specific strategy to win against certain opponents. Exact same thing. So I think this analogy will help you really understand the importance of adaptation and understanding that you can't just come in with a static strategy every single time. Now, note, guys, Because League is all, I always talk about this, League is all about all the small details. If you're not maximizing all the small details, that might be the difference between you losing that skirmish, or you losing that 1v1, or you losing that team fight, or not having pressure on a specific wave, or having pressure when it doesn't necessarily mean anything, which in turn can drastically decrease or increase your win rate over a large sum of games, because as we know, in order to climb in League of Legends, you're playing a ridiculous amount of games. So this is why my philosophy on why runes and itemization are so incredibly important. Now, before we get into the details, guys, there's one last point I really need to get across. Now, after talking to a bunch of people about runes, one of the, I guess, misconceptions that I've realized that people have with rune pages is that they only think about the main keystone, which is completely wrong. I personally weigh the main keystone exactly the same as every single row in each tree. So for example, if you're just trying to compare Zoe and pick the rune page for Zoe, if all you're thinking about is Electrocute versus Airy, then it's going to be really hard for you to decide which one's best for you. So in turn, you've got to really go down the tree and be like, okay, if I go Electrocute, then I'm going to have Taste of Blood. But conversely, if I go Area, I'm going to have Nimbus Cloak. Then you go to the next row, then you say, oh, okay, I'm going to have Transcendence versus this. Or I'm going to have Scorch versus Ravenous Hunter. What is it going to look like? What are the trade-offs? And this is why you really need to understand all the little details. You can't just look at the runes at face value and only look at the keystone, okay? Because every champion can largely take 2 or 3 different keystones. That's where you got to get into the nitty gritty, get into the details. So the first tree off the block, guys, is the precision tree. And the first rune within the precision tree is Press the Attack. Now, before we get to Press the Attack specifically, I just got a little quick note on the right hand side here, guys. The way I like to view Precision Tree is that it's very rarely seen on mid lane mages. The only mages you see it on are like Corki, Azir, and Cassiopeia. And then outside of that, it's predominantly a secondary tree because people want access a lot of the time to either Triumph or Presence of Mind and Coup de Grace. Generally, you see it on either assassins, aggressive assassins, or bruisers and AD carries. So you don't really see it on many mid lane champs, but it is very important to understand for secondary purposes and also just for general knowledge of the game. Now, Press the Attack. You hit the enemy 3 times, each time gives a stack, and after the 3rd stack, you deal damage, makes them exposed, causing them to take more damage from all sources for 6 seconds. Now, some of the main strengths of Press the Attack is that it's great for bursting targets during 2v2s due to exposed damage. So let's just say you're playing Aurelia, you go on your opponent, then your jungler comes from the side, and then as long as you guys are focusing the same target, you can abuse the exposed damage, and they take a lot of damage. So it's very, very good for that. Very great for 2v2s, especially when the jungler's playing around mid lane. Has a very low cooldown, which is amazing. Solid for heavy trading, aggressive lanes, and it spikes very, very early. Now, in terms of when to take it, you generally want to take it when you're looking to play a lane kingdom style through burst oriented trades. It's not something that you want to take if you're planning to relax and take very minimal trades within the laning phase. And it synergizes very well with champs that have that their trades revolve around a lot of auto attacks and specifically auto attack resets. So that's why you generally see this rune on Lucian specifically because of how his passive works. He's going to get a lot of auto attacks through, stack it up incredibly fast, and actually abuse the exposed damage, which is very, very helpful. Now, conversely, on the right-hand side, the last strength down the bottom here, and when to take it is, you generally only want to be taking it when the jungle is playing around you. If you're in an isolated 1v1, yes, it's still fine, but in order to get the max amount of damage, it's better in those early 2v2s, as long as you're focusing on the exact same target. So on the right-hand side here, guys, we have weaknesses. First one is that you got to be careful because you actually lose stacks when changing targets. So it's not really good in long extended fights. If you're having long extended fights, then you're much better off with either Lethal Temper or Conqueror. So it's good in those kind of like those short, bursty, all-in type of trades. It doesn't scale as well as Lethal Temper or Conqueror, mainly because of those long team fights and having to change targets in those team fights. And it's not really good from behind at all, because if you get behind, you lose the laning phase with press the attack, it basically gives you no utility. and you need to be in auto attack range to even utilize it. So it's a very bad rune from behind. Generally, you don't want to take it if you're looking to minimize the early lane and you're looking to like kind of sit back, relax, get to key item spikes. It's only taken if you spike relatively early within the game. And if your kit doesn't revolve around auto attacks, there's no point in taking this rune, because it's literally only stacked up with auto attacks, and so it's very important. And if you're not playing to win the lane very hard, again, because it doesn't give you any utility in mid to late game, then again, I would not opt in for this specific rune. Now for Lethal Tempo. Now Lethal Tempo is actually one of my favorite runes in the entire game, and it's an incredibly misunderstood rune page. So if you guys out there verse a lot of Azirs or play Azir or Corki, and you wonder why a lot of these champions take Lethal Tempo, this is the the rune for you, and this is the page for you to really understand. Now, the way Lethal Tempo works is, for 1.5 seconds after damaging a champion, gain attack speed based on level for 3 seconds, and when attacking a champion, it extends it to 6 seconds. And note, it allows you to exceed the attack speed limit. So the main strengths of this Lethal Tempo is that it's great in extended teamfights, especially when shredding frontline. Now, it's great in teamfights when it's in one area. If the enemy is running away, then it's kind of hard, because then it goes on cooldown. You're not constantly attacking champions, so it doesn't get extended, and then you're kind of screwed. But if you're versing a lot of frontline champions that are just sitting there soaking a lot of damage, you can sit there and absolutely shred them. So it's very good for that with Azir and Corki, and it's one of the best runes for lane priority and wave clear. Now, this is where Lethal Tempo gets extremely misunderstood. Now, what people realize with Lethal Tempo, especially when playing champions like Azir, is that, as you know, if you probably watch my guide, your offense is your defense. So what actually happens is you put your soldier down in a lane, you proc Lethal Tempo on the enemy just by like because the auto attack from Lethal Tempo with the soldier actually procs Lethal Tempo. And then what happens with that attack speed, having extended it to 6 seconds, you can use that 6 seconds to use that attack speed to auto down the wave, which gives you lane control, which gives you priority, which allows you to, again, consistently burst down the wave, poke them under tower, and be a very annoying lane presence. And it's actually one of the reasons why Corki can survive a lot of the early lanes as well, because he runs at them with the Gatling gun, procs to Lethal Tempo, can just sit back, relax, and just auto down the wave. And then it also gives them that late game scaling as well. So it's a very versatile rune. And which is one of the other main strengths, is that it's useful during the entire game. It's very rare that you find a rune that is both useful within the early lane and the mid game and the late game. So it's a very solid rune. You generally want to take it when your kit largely revolves around auto attacks for obvious reasons, when you want your offense to be your defense and you really want to be playing for the wave in the early game, when you need to shred tanks and play front to back team fights. Pretty self-explanatory, guys. The main weaknesses is that it requires you to stay in the fight for a very long time to utilize. Obviously, if you're playing short bursty trades, then it's really not going to come in handy. If the fight moves, like I mentioned before, it's really hard. So let's just say you're playing Azir, and maybe your team's engaged way too far, you're trying to catch up, you throw your Q, your WQ combo, whatever, and your soldier's really far in the distance, and they just run out of your soldier range. So you get you proc the Lethal Tempo, and then there's no champions in range, so you can't auto. So then it just goes on cooldown, and then you just can't utilize it. So it's very important that you're able to. It's very helpful, to be in fights that are in one location that aren't moving. And which leads me to the main weaknesses, which it's very bad against poke and non-committal fights. So if you're playing a Azir and you're versing maybe a Xerath or a Vel'Koz that is just poking you from a distance, it's so hard to proc or utilize Lethal Tempo, because you're very rarely going to be playing that long extended fight. You're either just going to be going in for an Azir sec or just one-shotting someone quickly. So you don't really get any value from Lethal Tempo. So generally, if you're versing poke lanes as Azir, you either want to be going Halo Blades for that really aggressive early lane, or even just going like Comet and poking them out that way. So it's not really good in those non-committal poke fights, and it has obvious counterplay when on cooldown as well. So if they see you proc it and goes on cooldown, whether it's in the laning phase and mid game, again, really easy to play around. So you don't really want to be taking it when going in for short bursty trades. Then you should be going in for Halo Blades or Comet or something like that. You don't really want to take it if you're playing for all-in, so the counter to poke and non-committal fights is all-inning and forcing that really aggressive fight, which it doesn't really make sense then because it's just burst. So if you're a melee champion as well, Lethal Tempo is really unreliable. Because it's very rare that you're going to be in combat for that long, and if that's the case, then you might as well just go like Conqueror or something like that. And if you're looking to play fights fast with your composition, like I said before with all-inning, then again, you're not going to get much value from Lethal Tempo. Fleet Footwork, very important rune to understand. This is probably one of the strongest runes in the entire game as well. So how it works, attacking and moving, actually moving your character, builds energy, stacks up to 100. At 100, your next attack heals you and grants movement speed. Note, healing from minions is 20% less effective for ranged champions. Now, main strength, guys, great for minimizing lane to buy times for items or level spikes. So if you are looking to, so any of these champions here, you're playing Kassadin, you're playing Silas, you're playing for Akali. Akali wants Gunblade, Kassadin wants Roa, Silas wants Protobelt. Any of these champions with a very weak early laning phase, Fleet is very good for, sustaining, getting to that key item spike or key level, whether it's level 6 for Kassadin, without dying or taking really, really bad trades, or staying healthy enough in lane so you don't die. And also, extending the laning phase. It's also great for spacing. Now, people don't talk about this with Fleet Footwork, which leads me to a quick caveat here. Now, I had this discussion with a pro player, and my initial assumption with Fleet Footwork is that you would only take it with teleport, because the way I view it was, okay, Fleet Footwork, you don't really get much lane strength, so you might as well only take TP, play for the utility, play for the scaling, that sort of thing. But what I realized, and why it's actually kind of come into meta, is people have realized, especially with champions like Akali, you can actually creatively use the movement speed to get in range for Qs. Because one of the things that actually limit Akali, make her early lane quite tricky, especially if you go Conqueror, is that you can just get kited. It's very easy to get kited. You have to either use your E to get in range, which is unreliable, or you can't do it very often, or you just get chunked doing that. But conversely, if you wait for your the Fleet Footwork movement speed, you can use that to then get in range to use your Q on the enemy. So there's actually a lot of creative things, both disengage wise and engage wise, that you can do with Fleet Footwork, which actually meant that a lot of people started taking Ignite, because it allowed you to take such aggressive creative trades. So it's something to think about. It's a very versatile, definitely a very, very versatile rune. The next one is actually scales with AP. So Fleet Footwork, not many people know this, is that Fleet actually scales with AP. So that's why we saw Silas with Fleet Footwork, because it's a melee champion, all the champions are melee, and that's why the Silas ends up starting Doran's Ring, because the Doran's Ring both complements the HP and it complements the AP, which gives you more healing with Fleet Footwork as well. I believe it's like scales with like 30% of your AP. I don't know exactly the number, but it scales with AP. So it's very, very interesting. So any melee AP champion that starts Doran's Ring, it's actually very, very, very useful. So you generally want to take it against poke lanes or lanes that just straight up outrange you, so you're constantly getting harassed. It's good against short trading lanes as well. So if you want to play those short trades rather than long extended trades, then Fleet Footwork is very good, because you can go in, get the trade, get the movement speed and the heal, and get out. And it's great for people didn't talk about this as well, as skill shot oriented matchups. So if you're playing, again, if I'm playing Syndra into Akali and the Akali has Fleet Footwork, it's so incredibly hard for me to hit Qs if they properly utilize the movement speed of Fleet Footwork. Very, very annoying for that as well. And then just over here on the weaknesses on the right hand side, actually, sorry, one last bottom on the bottom left. If you want an extended laning phase. So if you want an extended laning phase, again, ties into all the rest of the points. You want to play for a specific item or a specific level, it's great for that. Now, for weaknesses, it actually doesn't scale well at all, because at that point, then you'd rather the damage, because the heal really doesn't do anything at that point. Useless in 2v2s. 2v2s are all about burst and damage, so basically offers nothing in 2v2s. Not good for all-in trades. So if you're looking for an all-in trade, it doesn't give you anything. All-in trades are very much about burst again. Doesn't really give you much. And it's not overly effective on ranged champions. Now, there are some champions that don't mind taking Fleet, something like a Corki or something like that, but it's really not that valuable. And if you don't want to take, or if you can get away with going another rune, then I would strongly recommend it. So for example, if I'm playing Corki, rather than going Fleet, I'd rather go Lethal Tempo than just get my sustain from Biscuits or Doran's Blade, or even like Biscuits Time Warp and just going Corrupting Pot, because I want to avoid taking Fleet. It's very low value on ranged champions. And you don't really want to take it when you have early solo kill threat. So if you're in a very easy, say you're in a relatively easy matchup, or a matchup where you don't, rather than playing for sustain, you can just play for burst. So if you're playing back in the day, maybe you're playing like Akali into like Yasuo, you could actually just go like Electrocute and just kill the enemy. Then, you know, it's a completely different story. Then you don't really need the sustain or the utility, durability that Fleet would give you. If you want to play for early 2v2, so your jungler's playing towards you in mid lane, then sometimes as well, I mean, Fleet's not really that good, because then if you get ahead early, say your jungle comes, you have a set play where your jungler's going to gank at level 3 or level 2, you get that early kill with Electrocute. Whether you're playing Cassidy and you get that early kill, it's a lot easier to snowball with something like Electrocute or Conqueror than it is with Fleet, because you're not going to be taking as much poke damage. You're always going to have push. And in lanes where you naturally win trades, again, you don't really need Fleet Footwork, sorry. And it's great on, it's not good with extended fight lanes. So if you're playing Akali versus Aurelia, yes, you can take Fleet if you're looking to play very defensive in the early game. Maybe you have a farm jungler and they have an aggressive jungler. But majority of the time, if you're playing an aggressive melee versus melee matchup, Conqueror just outperforms, especially in these long extended fights that Akali has with Shroud, or, you know, Aurelia, these sorts of champions that are sort of a long, consistent fight. Then Conqueror just gives a lot more value, and Fleet literally offers nothing in those long, extended fights. Now for Conqueror. So each basic attack or spell on the enemy grants 2 stacks of Conquerors for 6 seconds, gaining adaptive force per stack. Stacks up to 12 times. When it's fully stacked, you heal for 15% of damage dealt, 8% if you're a ranged champion. So a little side note here as well, guys. Ranged champions only gain 1 stack per basic attack, so that's something to keep in mind as well. So, some of the main strengths. Great for extended fights, even if the fight moves. So if you remember back to Lethal Tempo is not good if the fight moves, because then you lose, you can't proc it anymore, or you did proc it and then they ran away and you can't keep up, you can't keep hitting champions, so it just goes away or goes on cooldown. Whereas Conqueror, even if the fight moves, you can at least find someone to attack, and it maintains every single one of those stacks. So I find it a lot easier even if the fight moves. It's easy to keep up stacks even if switching targets. So if you think back to press the attack, you can't really afford to switch targets then, because then the stacks just go away. So again, it's really good for switching targets, these very chaotic long extended fights. Great against heavy frontline, because again, you're hitting them a lot more times, so you can get those 12 stacks, so you can get that healing. Really, really important, and it scales very well for obvious reasons. And again, it scales very well. Rather than just saying for obvious reasons, I'll be more specific. It scales well because later in the game, generally you are versing at least one form of frontline, especially if you're playing champions like these. They're going to be quite tanky at that point. They're going to have a lot of utility, a lot of mobility. They're going to be able to be in the fight for a considerable amount of time, whether it's Yasuo dashing around using his wind wall, Akali in Shroud, Aurelia EQing people, or even Cassio just eating down the opponent. You're going to be in fights for quite a while, especially with these champions, since they're not specifically burst oriented. So yeah, it does scale very well with the champions that take it. So it doesn't scale well if you're playing a burst, some like champion that doesn't use Conqueror well. It only scales well if you're playing a champion that utilizes it. When to take, synergizes with mobile champions that can stick on targets, because you want to make sure that you're really stacking it up, and able to constantly make sure you don't lose the stacks. Synergizes with champs with sustain damage, specifically auto attack oriented champions. If your kit has a lot of burst, then you're not really going to get much value from this, because again, you want to be building up the stacks and shredding people and utilizing the heal. And then the third point here is, wait for this thing to go away, is great within melee versus melee matchups. Again, like I referred to before, if you're playing Akali versus Aurelia, it's going to be a long extended fight, a lot of trading auto attacks, a lot of abilities. So it's likely that you're going to be able to get up to 12 stacks, which makes it very, very valuable. Something to keep in mind. And then here on the right-hand side, weaknesses, hard to utilize in the early game due to mana and vulnerability to ganks. Now, what I mean by this is in the early game, it's very rare that a skirmish goes on for that long that you actually get value from the healing, because people are so squishy, they have no HP. By the time you stack it up enough, either the fight's done, they're already dead, and it's generally laning phase 1v1, so you can't switch targets or anything like that. So it's basically useless in the entire early laning phase, and on top of that, you're not going to have enough mana or energy to spam abilities to even utilize it. And on top of that, if you do want to be in the fight for that long for some reason, then you're probably either going to just die to a gank because you're overextended, or just by then someone's going to have to be able to react to that fight. So it's not really, you don't really want to be utilizing or thinking of it in terms of an early game rune. You must be in the fight for a long time, so that's it's very obvious or one-dimensional in that sense. So if the fights go really quickly or someone gets caught, then it's going to be kind of hard. And without mobility, it is very hard to use. So if your champion doesn't have mobility, it's going to be hard for you to catch up, even if they flash or they get away or they use their gap closer. If you don't have a gap closer yourself or some form of mobility, then it's going to be hard for you to maintain those stacks. That's why if you think about any of these champions, they have a considerable amount of either movement speed or mobility just automatically built in within their kit, or dashes or that sort of thing. You don't really want to be taking it if you have a very weak laning phase. At that point, if you have a very weak laning phase, then you typically want to be going fleet or something else that will give you a little bit more early strength, whether it's Electrocute or PT or like PTA, or like, just something like that. Something else that's going to give you a little bit more laning strength, or even Phase Rush or something like that for Cassio. If getting 12 stacks for you is unreliable, whether it's due to the composition, everyone's really squishy, or for whatever reason, whether your champion doesn't have enough mobility, you're not versing any frontline, that sort of thing, then again, it's just really not worth it. You always got to be viewing it as, if my champion can get 12 stacks and utilize those 12 stacks, then Conqueror is probably a decent choice for me. If you're against a lot of squishies, most likely the fights are going to be played way too fast, and again, you'll get way more value out of burst-oriented runes and itemization. So, for example, if you're playing, that's why back in the day, actually, before the Bork changes, PTA Aurelia was actually taken a lot into a lot of like squishier team compositions, and even Akali as well, a lot of against squishies. People still to this day do go Electrocute Akali time to time when versing a lot of squishy compositions, because you're just not going to be utilizing that Conqueror. So it's something to think about as well. And if you're heavily outranged, then Conqueror doesn't get too much value as well, because it's going to be so hard for you to get onto that champion to actually stack it up and utilize it. So a lot of the time then, if you're getting heavily outranged, then you might need to go for something that's either short bursty trades oriented or sustain with Phase Rush or Fleet Footwork. But if you do have a strong 2v2 and you have a plan, your duo with your jungle, you can actually tell your jungle to come gank mid, force a bit of chaos. And then if you get ahead with Conqueror, then it's a completely different story. Then you can probably afford to take damage, heavy trade, get onto the opponent, and actually utilize Conqueror and Conqueror's scaling. So it can work if you play towards mid-jungle 2v2. Now for the rest of the tree, guys. We're going to get into every single row, guys. Yes, as you can see, this is probably going to be quite a long video, but it is very important to go step by step, row by row, really understanding how these runes actually work. Now, the first one is Overheal. So, excess healing on you gives you a shield. This is a very misunderstood, it's actually a very misunderstood rune, actually. So, a few points here. You only really want to be taking it in extremely favorable matchups, because if you're getting poked a lot, you're losing trades, and you're not really going to get enough HP to you actually get the shield in the first place. So, it's a very niche rune, and you only want to be doing it in very niche situations. And it's also niche because there's barely any heals in the game. If you think about it, you could count how many heals are in the game on like two hands. There's very little champions that have inbuilt heals within their kit. So the situations you do want to take it is if you are wanting an extended laning phase, you're in a very good matchup and you want an extended laning phase, and it's champions that build lifesteal, they build Bork. So this is why you generally see it, or sometimes you see it on champions like Kalista and Lucian when they're building an early Vampiric Scepter, and they're getting that early lifesteal, and again, then maybe they're completely outranging the opponent, so they're never going to get hit. So if you see Kalista versus, say, like a Darius top or something, he's just kiting, or a Vayne top versus like a Darius, they're just kiting, they're never taking any damage. They actually get a lot of value from Overheal, because again, they build it within their kit, they easily build a Vampiric Scepter, and they can easily get value from that shield, which will protect them from the all-in when that person eventually does get frustrated, flash on them, etc. It is a very feast or famine rune, so it's not very reliable. I think it's one of the least reliable runes in the entire game, because you have to play flawlessly to make it work, and you only see Overheal in very high elo games when people are very, very confident in their matchup. And also, it's competing against two of the strongest runes in the entire game, Triumph and Presence of Mind. So it's very, very, very niche rune that I wouldn't recommend to many of you, especially if you're not already a very competent player. Now, Triumph, takedowns restore missing health, and yes, you do get a little bit of gold as well, but I didn't put that in there. It's one of the most reliable and versatile choices. It's great for skirmishes, great in heavy trade, close assassin matchups where you're heavy trading, but whether you're playing like Fizz versus Zed or something, if the Fizz takes Triumph, that can literally be the difference between just surviving an all-in, getting that kill with Ignite, and surviving the Ignite or burst damage from Zed on the back end. So, these very close assassin matchups is very, very useful. It synergizes well with any dive-oriented champion, any assassin. Really great on bruisers as well, because if you're opting in for the precision tree, a lot of the time, these tanky bruisers top lane don't really get value from Presence of Mind, since mana and energy is not really their problem. They're more CDR problems. Like, their problems revolve around CDR. So they don't have the problem of needing more mana or more energy. So generally they opt in for Triumph. That's generally the choice they opt in for. And then lastly, Presence of Mind, probably one of the most meta runes in the entire game right now. People have realized how strong this rune page actually is. And so takedowns restore mana or energy, increase the total pool. It's great with any mana or energy hungry champions like, Akali. Zed is decent with it. Any of those high range control mages like Kog'Maw and any high mana cost champion. Even nowadays, Syndra with it is quite decent, those sorts of champions. It's solid in nearly all portions of the game. If your champion is gated by energy and mana and not cooldowns, then it's probably worth taking. So what I mean by that is it's the opposite to Triumph. You generally want to take Triumph if you're gated by having high cooldowns, whereas conversely, because if you have high cooldowns, you're not going to be able to spam abilities, right? Generally, champions go when they want to spam abilities. But champions that have high cooldowns, these tanky bruisers that have high cooldowns, they don't have a mana or energy problem, so they just go Triumph. But conversely, if you have low cooldowns or you want to be spamming abilities, then, Presence of Mind is probably something that you should be considering. And something you need to take in mind as well. If you're going Presence of Mind, you're sacrificing skirmish strength. Because if you want to play for skirmishing, then Triumph a lot of the time trumps Presence of Mind, because those aggressive all-in 2v2s or aggressive 1v1s, Triumph can be literally the difference between getting the kill and getting out, not trading kills, or even getting dives off, that sort of thing. So Triumph's a very, very versatile rune, whereas this is just something very much a more calculated rune if you're looking to go, or very snowball-heavy rune as well, and it scales incredibly well, so there's something to think about. Now, next row, Legend Alacrity. Gain 3% attack speed plus 1.5% each legend stack. It synergizes very well with champions that already build and revolve their itemization around attack speed. It's not really a common choice outside of Z in the mid lane specifically, due to the power of tenacity and how, I would say right now, as the meta has evolved over the years, people have realized how strong CC is and how important CC is within a composition in terms of allowing plays to be made. So a lot of people spec secondary into the precision tree just for legend tenacity. Legend Alacrity is it's generally not a common, very niche, not a common rune choice for a lot of mid lane. It's generally seen in the 80 carry role. So it's generally good when versing squishies, obviously, because you get more attacks off, bursting people much easier, and when you're not really versing any CC. It's a very, I guess, composition-dependent rune. You need to be assessing how much CC is on the enemy team, that sort of thing. Now, Legend Tenacity, on the other hand, is where you gain 5% Tenacity plus 2.5% each Legend stack, max 10 stacks. Most reliable, versatile choice defensively and offensively. You don't just view it in terms of defense. Like, it's great on any diving champion where they want to, obviously they're going to probably have to either face check some, or, with their face, some form of hard CC or self-peel, whether it's an Ash Arrow, a Syndra E, any form of hard CC, whether it's the support CCing them or whatever reason, Leona stun. It's great for getting past that, getting out of it, and then continuing to dive onto the back line. It's very, very important. Or conversely, even if you're playing some form of long-range control mage and they try to dive on you, CC you, that can be the difference between living and surviving. Very, very amazing defensively and offensively. Great on melee champions, especially divers for the reason I said before. Crucial against heavy CC compositions. Synergizes very well with Mercury Treads. Scales incredibly well. And probably one of the most common choices for mid laners, especially now in this meta and as the games actually evolve. So very, very great choice. This is probably one of the strongest runes in the entire game because of how hard Tenacity is to build as well. There's barely any items in the entire game that give you Tenacity. And Tenacity over the years has actually been nerfed because Riot actually realized how OP Tenacity is. And back in the day, I believe it was easier to, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe Tenacity was easier to build. I believe there was an item that gave you Tenacity outside of Mercs, but I'm not 100% sure. My brain's kind of fried at the moment. But then you've got Legend Bloodline. Another extremely misunderstood rune, where you gain 0.6 lifesteal for each legend stack, max at 20 stacks, and as you can already tell, because it has 20 stacks, it's a much more scaling-oriented rune, because it's very OP, and lifesteal, as a stat, guys, in League of Legends, is incredibly overpowered. People don't understand, or they don't realize how strong lifesteal is as a stat, and it's very, very, very valuable. And that's why Riot always make the meta, if you think back to the meta, actually, there's a point here. It's a very meta-dependent rune because if you think about it, Riot, especially when it comes to bot lane, it's a constant push and pull between making items like Bork and, you know, Bloodthirster and things like that really strong, and then the more utility-focused ones like Essence Reaver that give you CDR and damage. So it's a constant push and pull between lifesteal and damage and utility, because lifesteal is such a valuable stat, especially for people in the bot lane. It's a very, very greedy rune choice for mid laners. You basically never take it as a mid laner. But it's not as really greedy for 80 carries because you're scaling into mid to late game anyway. And the great thing about Legend Bloodline is that it allows you to skip lifesteal items, which is solid right now in the meta because the meta in bot lane is largely items like Essence Reaver, which don't give you any lifesteal. So it actually allows you to bypass building Bork, and it gives you a really solid amount of lifesteal heading into mid game. It's great in slow lanes where you're taking little amounts of damage. So in any heavy trading lane, then Legend Bloodline doesn't give you anything. It's basically only useful once you get to mid game around 20 minutes. Before 20 minutes, it's basically negligible. And as I said before, it's very meta-dependent rune. So it's a very, very interesting rune not many people understand. Now for the third row, Crude Rune. Deal 8% more damage to champions who have less than 40% health. Probably one of the most reliable rune choices within this row due to how often it can be procced, but we'll get to a little bit later and how this kind of compares to Last Stand. There is a lot of juicy information here. Great when you have a favorable matchup. If you're losing your matchup, you're not in a favorable position, then Coup de Grace, you're not really going to get too much value. Generally, you see Coup de Grace with a lot of burst-oriented champions, a lot of all-in champions. You generally see it with a lot of assassins, champions like Fizz, that sort of thing. And it's solid for 2v2s because 2v2s are all about burst. They're all about getting in there, getting that burst kill, focusing all your attention on that same champion, getting in, getting out. So it's very solid for those 2v2 kills. And we'll kind of go more on this later when we go to Last Stand because we need to talk about the comparisons in terms of damage that Coup de Grace comparatively to Last Stand. Now, Cut Down. Deal 5% to 15% more damage to champions based on how much more max HP they have than you. So, keynotes here. 100% take it when you're versing 3 tanks, but if you're versing 2 tanks, then it's 50-50. There's a few things you need to understand about Cut Down. It really doesn't give you much value until 15 minutes because everyone's HP is actually somewhat similar before then. So it's actually, the way you should view Cut Down, it's actually very similar to Legend Bloodline. It's a very scaling, long-term investment scaling rune. You're not going to get barely any value with it within the early portion of the game because it's all about how much more max HP they have than you. So because no one really builds, not many champions build HP until later in the game or when they get considerable amount of HP. Very scale heavy rune. You need sustain damage to make it worth taking. If you're a burst oriented champion, then you're not going to get any value from it. That's why you very rarely see this rune on champions like Fizz or any assassin. You only see it on champions like Cassio or 80 carries predominantly in a time take this. You need sustained damage. It's a very, very niche rune because due to forcing you to change your build path. So this is actually, again, something that people don't really talk about, but incredibly important to understand. if you're playing a champion that naturally builds HP, so let's just say you're playing Lucian, right? If you're playing Lucian and you're versing a lot of frontline, a lot of the time you're going to be building Black Cleaver. But then if you're building Black Cleaver, then this doesn't make sense, right? Because again, you deal damage based on how much more max HP they have than you. So if you're taking cut down, then you should be thinking to yourself, okay, I really can't be affording to build Black Cleaver or any HP oriented item. This is what makes this rune specifically really good on Kalista, because Kalista struggles versus a lot of frontline champions and doesn't build Black Cleaver. It doesn't build any HP. So that's something you need to think about. If you're taking cut down, you need to change the way your build's actually going to look as you go through that game. So now for Last Stand, guys, you deal 5 to 11% increased damage to champions while you are below 60% HP, max damage gained at 30% HP. So it's decent if your champion naturally gets low during all-ins, especially if you're playing champions, melee champions, because again, a lot of the time if you're a melee champion, you're in the action, you're taking a lot more damage. Whereas, you know, on the other side, if you're playing a ranged champion, then a lot of the time you're not going to be trading that much HP. You're just going to be sitting back, relaxing, abusing your range advantage, or sitting back using your abilities on the wave. But a champion like Yasuo or Aurelia or Sylas or Akali are getting into the thick of it. They're getting quite low. They're getting poked down. This is where Last Stand kind of comes into play. Now, it's actually a very underrated rune. So hear me out, guys. What I've realized is that a lot of even like melee burst oriented champions, they default to Coup de Grace, which, you know, it makes a lot of sense. But if you are in some form of heavy trading melee versus melee matchup, or even a very tricky matchup like, you know, maybe you're playing Fizz versus Syndra, where it's heavy trading both ways. Like this, the Fizz obviously is going to get the Syndra very, very low, but the Syndra will poke down the Fizz moderate, like a lot throughout the laning phase as well, with Qs and Ws and Es and auto attacks. So something you need to think about, if you're heavy trading with your opponent, you get value from this rune if you are around below 60% HP. So if you're trading, you've got the enemy to 60% HP and you're 60% HP, you get no value from this rune, whereas you get value straight away. You're already getting value. But conversely, if you're heavy trading and then you've already got them to 40% and, you know, this is at 40%, you're basically nearly at 8% damage anyway. You're basically at 8% damage anyway. So if you're in any champion that's taking a lot of damage, whether you're getting poked down, that sort of thing, Last Stand is something that you should consider, especially if you're in matchups like Sylas versus Akali, Aurelia versus Akali. To be honest, this is something that I'm actually tempted to think more about when playing those heavy trading Fizz matchups, or even heavy trading like Zed versus Zoe as well, because when I'm playing Zed versus Zoe, I'm getting poked down, constantly harassed. Now, yes, Coup de Grace probably scales a little bit more when you're making picks because you're going to be full HP, but specifically for the early lane, I would say Last Stand a lot of the time is going to give you a bit of value. So kind of, as long as you're thinking about this and thinking about how you interpret the trading pattern in your experiences, how low are you in this specific matchup, it is important to think about. And I actually get angry when a lot of people just default response to Coup de Grace, where Last Stand can be a very, very viable option. And the last point here, guys, is that it's a very complex rune and a very high skill cap rune. You know, especially when you're playing Sylas, like you want to be as low as possible to get the max damage before using your W and you know, healing up with Corrupting Pot. Sorry, I see a lot of Sylases just default healing up with Corrupting Pot before they can actually utilize all their damage while they're at low HP with their Q and their E and that sort of thing. So it's a very high skill cap rune as well. Now for the domination tree, guys, the first rune off the block is Electrocute. Now, before we get into Electrocute's little details, let's quickly talk about the domination tree. Now, the way I like to view the domination tree is that I don't really like it as a main tree. I find it a very great and versatile secondary tree because, like I said before, sustain and lifesteal in general is a very hard to purchase or hard to get your hands on stat. So through domination, you get access to Taste of Blood, you get access to Ravenous Hunter. This is generally why you see domination a lot as a secondary tree. And if possible, unless I'm playing Assassin, I try to avoid the domination tree as my main tree, purely because it feels like some of the rows are completely useless, specifically the second and the third row, and we'll get into that a little bit later on. But you generally only see this as a main tree on, you know, very burst-oriented diving champs or assassins. So the main strengths, guys, or actually starting with Electrocute, hitting a champion with 3 separate attacks or abilities within 3 seconds deals adaptive damage. Great for burst oriented short trades because it has a relatively long cooldown. It synergizes very well with champions that just want to wait for their key ability, then go in for a trade. So, for example, Zed wants to go in for that, that WEQ combo, proc the Electrocute, wait for the W to get back off cooldown, rinse, repeat. Same with Fizz, with going in with E, doing a full trade, getting out, that sort of thing. A lot of these short, bursty assassins with relatively high cooldowns love Electrocute. Synergizes well with dive-oriented all-ins. Relatively easy to proc because it's actually procced off both auto attacks and abilities. So you generally want to be taking it when you want solo kill pressure, or it's actually really great in 2v2s because, as I said before, 2v2s are all about burst, and it actually synergizes well with burst-oriented junglers. So if your jungler maybe has they offer the CC, or maybe they have burst within their kit as well. As long as you're targeting the same person, there's a lot of burst within there. Maybe you can even, there's actually champions or jungle champions that go Electrocute. If the mid laner and the jungle have Electrocute, or even they go Halo Blades and you go Electrocute, there's a lot of burst. Really, really solid for 2v2s. It's actually pretty good when your champion can't necessarily stay in the fight for a long time and they just want to go in and out. So again, a lot of these champions, they don't want to be sitting there auto attacking because they're very squishy. They just want to use their key ability, get the one shot, get out. And if your champion has longer cooldowns, this is probably something that you should be potentially considering. And it's only good if you're proccing it reliably every single time it's off cooldown. If you're in a matchup where you're considerably outranged and you're not really going to get in range to utilize Electrocute reliably, then I try to avoid it, because then it's like, surely there's another rune that I can go to. Some people disagree with me here. That's just my personal take on it, because I just feel like, again, because Electrocute's not really offering me any... It's not really offering me any utility. It's pure damage, and the rest of the tree as well isn't overly amazing. I would rather, at that point, if I'm not reliably proccing it, just put it into secondary tree. That's with Nocturne, right? I don't feel like on Nocturne I can reliably proc it all the time. That's why I would way rather Lethal Tempo and just get the sustain or the ultimate cooldown from the secondary tree. So that's my preference. Now for weaknesses, it generally requires you to trade and posture quite aggressively to proc. So you have to be getting in the action. So you can't really sit back and relax. It's not good in sustained fights or if you don't one shot. So if you don't one shot the enemy and you just you go in, you try to go for the one shot, you use your Electrocute, but it's not enough, then you're probably in a little bit of a sticky situation. That's generally when... So that's why Electrocute in general is actually bad against heavy frontline. If you go in and you don't burst that tank, then it just went, all right, screw you, I'm just going to run at you and kill you. That's why against heavy frontline, you generally don't want to be going Electrocute and going something like Conqueror or, Lethal Tempo or something like that. And offers no utility. And you can Dark Harvest is actually another one we'll talk about, which is better into heavy frontline as well. Don't take when your champion has low cooldowns, because if you have low cooldowns, then maybe you want to be going Halo Blades, or maybe you want to be going Airy, or something else like that, or potentially press the attack or something like that. Then Electrocute probably isn't going to be giving you a lot of value because it has a relatively high cooldown. And if you're in an unfavorable matchup, like I said before, if you're getting outraged or it's really hard for you to take decent trades, it's going to be hard for you to proc, which means you're not going to get much value, which means I probably wouldn't recommend taking Electrocute. Now for Predator. Now, Predator got completely gutted when it got nerfed, so I'm not a fan of Predator at all, but it is important to understand, obviously. Generally, how it works, you just enchant your boots with an active effect, you gain movement speed ramping up to 45% over 1.5 seconds while chasing enemy champions. After ramping up, you deal bonus adaptive damage. I'm just not a fan of this rune at all. I feel like it's very unreliable. But just for the strengths, guys, it's great for roaming towards a skirmish for man advantages. So maybe you see a skirmish in the river, 1v1 between the two junglers, and you and the enemy mid laner are just looking at it. You're like, who wants to get there first? Because if you can influence that matchup, the first person who gets there is probably going to turn the tides, turn it quickly from a 1v1 into a 2v1, and because early 2v2 is very burst oriented, then you're probably going to come out ahead. That's generally the main situations you're going to be using it. It's solid for burst-oriented skirmishes. Again, something to think about Predator, guys, and why I'm not a fan of it. Because it basically gives you no laning strength, The only situations where Predator is useful is when you have priority or pressure to roam. But how does that work? You have no lane strength, yet how are you going to find a way to use it? So it's like kind of counterintuitive. And the reason Predator was taken before the nerfs is because it had extra utility. You could use it on the way back to lane to give you tempo, to give you the room to roam. Or you could use it from a way further a distance away to get you into a creative position. It wasn't only towards chasing enemy champions either. You could use it for roams in itself. Even if you had even priority with the enemy, you could still go for a creative roam even when there were no champions nearby. I just found like right now, since they changed it, it just doesn't really have an identity in my opinion. But anyway, main strength, solid for burst-oriented skirmishes because it does give you that bonus adaptive damage. When to take it, if you're not really playing for the 1v1, you're more playing for 2v2s because it really doesn't give you much in the 1v1. If your champion lacks gap closing capabilities, it can give them a little bit of mobility to help them get into the fights and get their damage off. That's generally why you do see it, if you do see it on something like an Annie or a Vlad who really need that mobility to get in the fight because they have very little gap closes. But in saying that, if you do need that, you might as well just go something like Phase Rush anyway on Vlad. And if you can't get pressure in the lane 1v1 anyway, so you're just kind of all-inning on the 2v2, then Predator can be a decent option. Now, weaknesses. Has a very high cooldown, 90 to 60 seconds. Only works when their enemies are around, so it's very one-dimensional, and you can't really be creative with it anymore. It gives you no lane strength utility, and it's really hard to justify over Phase Rush, because Phase Rush is just much more versatile. It can be procced much more often. It can be Phase Rush is very good for offense and defensive purposes, whereas Predator is only really good for offensive purposes. You don't really want to take it if you want pressure in mid lane, if your champion already has mobility, or your kit revolves around sustained damage. If your kit revolves around sustained damage, then you're not going to get any value from this bonus burst. And then you're better off going something that will give you sustained damage over the course of an entire long team fight. Now for Dark Harvest. Again, I actually don't mind this rune. It's a bit of a misunderstood rune. Damaging an enemy below 50% health deals adaptive damage, harvests their soul, and permanently increasing the Dark Harvest damage. Now, it scales extremely well for obvious reasons. You're constantly stacking up that Dark Harvest, permanently increasing that damage. Easy to stack up if your champion has burst within their kit. That's generally why you see it on champions like Annie and Zoe that have a massive amount of burst damage that can allow you to get that stack. That's why I personally love it on Annie's, because it allows me, as soon as I hit 6, I'm using my Tibbers with my stun ready to go, doing a full combo on the enemy, guaranteeing myself to get that stack and really stacking it up early in the game. So that's generally the type of champs you want to put it on. And it can be procced in team fights multiple times. So the way it works is if you get a takedown, so an assist or a kill, it refreshes so you can proc it again and again and again. So if you're playing Annie, your Tibbers is running around, proccing on all the different members. You get it, and one of them dies, and, you just keep popping off. It's just very, 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 very good. When to take, synergizes with burst-oriented champs with high cooldowns, like I said before, when you don't have early kill threat anyway, and you're just focusing on the scaling, which ties into the way I like to play Annie. It's like my early laning's kind of dog poo anyway, so I might as well all in on that scaling, mid to late game identity by the time I have my Rylai's and my Liandry's. If I all in on that identity, at least I'm going to be so strong by that point that I can potentially carry. That's the way I interpret taking Dark Harvest on Annie. So if you don't really have kill threat, you just want to farm the early game, then Dark Harvest can be a viable option. It's great in slower paced games and long extended team fights. Its main weaknesses is that it actually takes a long time to create meaningful threat. Like, you at least need, I actually talk about it here, you need at least 6 stacks for it to be remotely useful. So it takes a very long time to be useful. It doesn't help you at all with your early trading, has a relatively high cooldown, and it's actually hard for a lot of champions to get the enemy below 50% HP because there's nothing to help you to get from 100 to 50. Right? There's nothing there that's going to help you there. Whereas Electrocute, that can help you. Just keep bursting the enemy down in short trades. So it's a very much, the way I like to view it's like a win more rune. So if you're winning already, then Dark Harvest is OP. So if I'm playing Annie and my 2 side lanes are winning and I have Dark Harvest and I'm just scaling up, it feels ridiculous. It's like a free win. Like even if I have one winning side, it feels like with Annie, with this Dark Harvest, like I can guarantee the win essentially. And it's a very feast or famine rune, for those above reasons. don't really take, you shouldn't be taking it if you don't have burst within your kit, because it's going to be hard to get the enemy below 50% HP. Don't take it when you really need to push the pace of the game or want to push the pace of the game in the early game, because then you can push the pace of the game with a myriad of other runes like Hail Blades or Electrocute or Comet or Airy, anything like that. And if you really want to dominate your lane, then this is not the rune for you either. Now for Hail of Blades. So the way it works, you gain 110% attack speed when you attack an enemy for up to 3 attacks. No more than 3 seconds can elapse between attacks or it will end. Attack resets increase the attack limit by 1. Now, a few strengths, guys. It's great for constant, aggressive, short trades, especially since they actually removed the out of combat element. Before they actually buffed it, because before what happened is that you actually had to go out of combat to refresh the cooldown, I believe. But now you can literally be in combat all the time, and it has a very, very short cooldown, so you can constantly proc it. That's why it's very good on Azir, because every single time your Q's up, you just go, you get the quick attacks. This is awesome. Really, really good for aggressive short trades. Has a very low cooldown, so it can be procced often. Great against a lot of squishy targets, because again, for the same reason, it's a short burst of damage. Bang, bang, bang. But if you're versing a champion with a lot of resistances and HP, then you need more than 3 attacks. You're going to need a lot of a range of attacks. Like, that's when Conqueror or Lethal Tempo really comes into play. When to take it, when you want to be very lane dominant, when you're trying to push the pace of the game in the early game and play very like Lane Kingdom. It synergizes very well with stacking auto attack abilities. So champions like Rek'Sai, Kai'Sa, and Xin Zhao, who, you know, they want to stack up that ability, get a few auto attacks off to get that empowered auto attack, or whatever that ability is. It's very synergizes very, very well with them. And then weaknesses on the right hand side here, does not scale well in team fights for that same reason. It's only for burst, because a lot of the time, I mean, team fights are less about burst and more about sustained damage. But, you know, that's when you should probably be, if you're playing for team fights and trying to shred tanky members, and you probably shouldn't be going Hail of Blades. You're actually forced to take aggressive trades often, because if you're not really able to proc it reliably, or you're not willing to proc it reliably, and because it doesn't scale well, then you're not really going to get much value from it. And because you're forced to be in auto attack range a lot, it can be quite risky for a lot of champions. Like, because Azir, in order for Azir to get value from this rune, you have to be constantly using your Q aggressively forward. And there are a lot of matchups where you can't afford to do that, because then you get ganked by the jungler, or your jungler's a farm jungler versus an aggressive jungler, that sort of thing. So you've got to be quite careful when taking Hail of Blades. And you have to get value from it, from the entire tree, in order to make it worth it. Because this is such an early aggressive, like such an early oriented rune for mid laners, I don't recommend taking it unless you really do get value from the entirety of the tree. This is something that I didn't take into account when taking Halo Blades on Azir. It felt like I was getting leads, but I couldn't translate, and that's why I think Lethal Tempo just is the more reliable rune choice for, or even Comet, because at least Comet, you get value from all the other rows, whereas, like I said before, the Domination tree isn't an amazing tree for basically any champion. Again, it's more of a secondary tree for a lot of champions, so if you don't get max value from the entire tree, then try to avoid it as much as you can. You shouldn't really be looking to take it when you're versing heavy frontline, want sustained fights, and if you're in an unfavorable matchup, if you want to play the lane slow and you can't really take aggressive trades, you should definitely not be taking Halo Blades. Now for cheap shot, guys, damaging champions with impaired movements or actions deals bonus true damage. It's on a 4-second cooldown. Now the key notes here, guys, you should only be taking cheap shot if you're playing a champion that can reliably proc it. Because Cheap Shot has such a low cooldown, what Riot is trying to tell you is that this doesn't do much damage, okay? This doesn't do much damage. So unless your champion has very low cooldowns, that has some form of slow or stun that can reliably proc it, then you should not be taking this rune. That's why the reason why you only see it generally if you're playing a Glacial champion, or maybe Azir Q in a very favorable matchup. You can take it because the Q gives you a slow if you hit it, that sort of thing. But even then, I'm just really not a massive fan. It's very feast or famine rune, and it doesn't scale well at all, and it's only decent when you're already in a favorable matchup, okay? It's a win more rune, because if you're in a matchup that is like, you know, constantly heavy trading or that sort of thing, you just get way more value out of Taste of Blood, because what HP advantage does is it doesn't just allow you to potentially have more kill opportunity, it also allows you to get tempo resets because you're going to have more of an HP advantage over the enemy, which means you'll get full control over the wave, that sort of thing. So this leads to more opportunities that can lead to more getting ahead in more a range of differing situations, way more than Cheap Shot in my opinion. So I'm just not a fan of Cheap Shot at all. Taste of Blood, heal when you damage an enemy champion. And guys, just a quick note, guys, I hate this row of runes. It's actually probably one of my least favorite row of runes in the entire game. And this is why, like, I mean, Taste of Blood is decent. This is a decent rune. But I hate Sudden Impact and Cheap Shot. I think that's extremely underwhelming runes that are very niche. Very, very niche. Keynotes for Taste of Blood. Most reliable rune choice due to how versatile it is, both offensively and defensively. Great for minimizing tough matchups, but also in heavy trading matchups, like I mentioned before, it can really give you that HP advantage. Very easy to proc due to auto attacks or abilities, procs of auto attacks or abilities. And it's very underrated because it's not sexy. Like when someone looks at runes, all they're looking for is damage. Like, oh, this gives me more damage. Actually, go this one. Like, who cares about damage? You got to think about utility. You got to think about sustain and resources, things like that. It's not sexy, yes, but it is a very good rune. It's a small wins rune, which is my personal philosophy on League. It's all about small wins, taking you have eventually over time have more HP than the enemy, which leads to favorable situations. And it also doesn't scale well at all. Then you got Sudden Impact on the right-hand side. After exiting stealth or using a dash, leap, blink, or TP, dealing any damage to a champ grants lethality and Magic Pen for 5 seconds, and it's on a 4-second cooldown. Now, again, there's not many champions that can reliably proc it. Again, think about champions that have a dash or a leap or a blink that are using it this often. Like a champion that has like again, it's a 4-second cooldown, which says to me, and Riot's trying to tell you that this doesn't give you shit. It really doesn't give you much stats at all. So unless your champion can reliably proc it, then I would not recommend this rune. It's generally great for burst-oriented all-in champs like Zed, Qiyana, and Fizz. Even then, I don't like it on Zed and Fizz because okay, on Fizz it's okay because it can be procced multiple ways, but Zed it can really only be procced with the E. Yes, you can get procced with the R, but in terms of the early laning phase, only with your W, Zed's W, which is on a very long cooldown, which means I don't like this. Unless you're going for a cheesy level 3 trade, I'm just not a fan. Qiyana, on the other hand, is okay because it does proc off the W and the E, so it's quite reliable. So if you are going Qiyana, then Sudden Impact is a good choice. It doesn't scale well, and it's very great for that Feast or Famine playstyle. If you want to play for those early solo kills, get in, get out, play the game very, very fast. So for this row, these are probably some of the most misunderstood runes in the entire game. So if there's any row that you're going to listen to or watch me, this is probably one of the rows that you really need to understand. So zombie ward on the left hand side here. Takedowns on enemy wards cause friendly zombie wards to sprout from their corpses. You gain adaptive force for everyone spawned up to 10. At 10, you gain 10 adaptive force. One of my favorite runes for roaming-oriented assassins, synergizes very well with Umbral Glaive and Sweeper. Not good if you don't really have access to the river. It's very common on champions like Fizz, Zed, and Qiyana, and it's actually very good on support. So generally you see it on supports, they go secondary domination, they'll go zombie ward with Relentless Hunter, and what they'll do is they'll just like roam around the map, sweep everything, place pinks, that sort of thing, clear all the enemy wards, and then spawn these wards everywhere. It's very good, I guess, scaling rune for a lot of supports, and it gives you a lot of utility. Now, something that you need to think about in terms of Fizz, there's actually some players like Mango Fish, he goes Zombie Ward, and one of the main reasons he goes Zombie Ward is because he's not going to have priority to utilize, he's not going to be able to put his wards up aggressively. Now, yes, there is an argument for him to take Eyeball Collection, but the way he likes to think about it, if he starts Sweeper level 1, he knows that most likely the enemy's going to try and build wave, harass under tower, or even ward level 1 so they don't get ganks level 2, because if you're trying to bully out of Fizz, you need a side to lean onto. You need vision so you can lean, build wave, shove, poke under tower. But if you don't have vision, it's so incredibly hard to do that strategy. So what this Mango Fish realizes, okay, I can actually sweep level 1 or hold my sweep at level 2, level 3, sweep those early wards, and then make it really, really hard for the enemy to build waves into me. Then at the same time, you're sweeping those wards, you're giving yourself vision, which means that you don't really need a vision trinket. So it was a creative usage of zombie ward. Again though, you got to be a little bit careful with zombie ward. I would only really use it if you are building Umbral Glaive, or you're very much swapping to sweep it in the early game and you want to play for roams, less for the 1v1. That's just something to think about. It is a very very high skill cap rune. So you've got to be careful when taking that one. Now for Ghost Porro. Now Ghost Porro is probably one of my favorite runes in the entire game. Really, really love this rune. When your wards expire, they leave a Ghost Porro, which grants vision for 60 seconds. Nearby enemy champs scare the Ghost Porro away. You gain adaptive force for each one spawned, and when it spots an enemy up to 10 stacks. Now, there's a lot of controversy around whether Ghost Porro or Eyeball Collection is more reliable. Now, I personally love Ghost Porro. Now the main reason is that as a mid laner, what do we know? We know that as a mid laner, we have so much access to amazing ward locations. No other role or no other lane has access to put a ward on the enemy raptors or straight onto an enemy buff or things like that, which is like a relatively short distance away from your lane. So what Dopa realized, he was one of the first that kind of swapped over to Ghost Porro and got a lot of value from it. He realized that if he timed his ward at a certain time, either level 1, putting a ward on the raptor camp and spotting out the enemy, or knowing that if the jungler started one side and pathed up to that side, it would guarantee proc the Ghost Porro, spot him, and then get 2 stacks straight away, because you've placed one. So you spawned one and you've actually spotted the enemy. So if you've got a really good understanding of jungle tracking and you really understand, or even you're getting pressure in your lane, like I said, you're great for champs with, you're getting a lot of priority, you got a winning matchup, and you can place your vision very, I guess, offensively, where you can guarantee to spot the enemy jungler, you get a lot of value. Not just in terms of you getting adaptive force, but for everyone else on the team. Like having a Ghost Porro sitting on the enemy raptors, that's awesome, because then it helps everyone on the entire team. So it's a very high utility and great for you and the entire team. So very, very underrated rune, a very high skill cap rune. It's not something that I'd recommend for beginners, but as you get better at the game, this is something that I'll experiment with. And the other thing about Ghost Porro that's interesting is what you can actually do, it's actually one of the fastest ways to give yourselves adaptive force. And I saw Showmaker do this. He literally puts the Ghost Porro, the ward, in the middle of the lane. And if you put the Ghost Porro in the middle of the lane, when you don't, maybe you're playing a champion that you know that you can't really get ganked. Maybe you assess the jungle matchup and you know they have no threat on you anyway, because you're just going to be either giving pressure or your champion just counters that champion, or you have a lot of mobility. And you put it in the middle of the lane. Not only, again, it's straight, as soon as that dies, it's going to spawn, and they're definitely going to step on it, because it's literally in the middle of the lane. So you can guarantee yourself getting 2 stacks straight away. So you can easily see there are so many creative ways to actually stack this up as fast as possible. It's actually one of the fastest ones to get to 10 stacks comparatively to something like Eyeball Collection. So as I said, the very high skill cap rune. You must be smart with its usage, but just be careful, guys, because if you make it obvious where you ward, if it gets swept, you don't get the adaptive force. So you got to be very, very careful with that. So as you can see, very high skill cap rune. Now, Eyeball Collection. You collect eyeballs for champion takedowns, gain adaptive force per eyeball collected. Upon 10 stacks, gain additional adaptive force. Probably one of the easiest to execute, but less utility runes. Yes, you don't really get any extra vision like Zombie Ward or Ghost Porro offers you. But again, all you need to do is get kills. Very takedown, sorry, which is very easy for a lot of people. Yes, you're not going to stack it up as fast, potentially as fast as these other ones. But it's just super easy. So it's generally what I would recommend for a lot of lower elo players. Great if you have a favorable matchup as well with a lot of kill threat where you know you're going to get early solo kills, but it's also viable if you get countered, because you can sit back, relax, and eventually you're going to get takedowns at some point, one way or another. And it's very controversial, like I said, in terms of reliability versus Ghost Porro. Like some people say this is the most reliable, whereas I say this is the most reliable. Again, I think it just really depends on your role and the elo that you're playing within. So it's just something to think about and potentially add into your gameplay and into your arsenal. Now, as you guys can see here, if you were just blindly going Zombie Ward or blindly going Ghost Porro because you saw some guide on Mobify or Pro Builds, you follow some pro rune page that you saw on a YouTube video, you can easily see how you're probably not getting value from this, and then if you're just gone eyeball collection, you just get more value because you don't know how to use it. Conversely, you just can see how understanding these runes is very, very important. Now for the last row within the domination tree, Ravenous Hunter, probably one of the strongest runes in the entire game in my opinion. This is probably what makes the domination tree viable for so many champions. Because like I said, lifesteal and sustain is such a sought after stat or sought after ability. Ravenous Hunter, heal for a percentage of damage dealt by your abilities. Keynotes, it's actually reduced the area of effect damage, although that's really not something to worry about too much. It's an insanely good rune, scales amazingly into the side lane, and because a lot of champions want to sell their pots. They don't want to sit on a refillable into mid game. They don't want to sit and buy more pots heading into the early game. Like, they just want to sit on their Ravenous Hunter and abuse that slot for more AP, more AD, or some other stat, or even buy pink wards. So it's actually very, very good when heading into the side lane. Very versatile, great for team fighting, great for laning. Overall, just a super, super solid rune. Ingenious Hunter, gain 15% active item CDR plus 5% per stack, includes trinkets. This is a very niche rune. It's only taken when you want to, I guess if you're either going glacial, because of how it synergizes with GLP and Twin Shadows. It also synergizes quite well with Predator, because it obviously gives you the active item CDR with the Predator on the boots. And it can also be sold with some champions that do build Proto Belt and Zhonya's, because it gives you that extra active item CDR. But again, it's so hard to justify Ingenious Hunter over something like Ravenous Hunter or Relentless Hunter or Ultimate Hunter, purely because of how important a lot of pit champions' ultimates are, or how important their mobility is, or how important just sustain is in general. And as you've probably noticed within this guide so far, how I've been hyping up sustain in general. So really only be looking to take this if you are going glacial. And it's hard, like I said, hard to justify over the others. Now, Relentless Hunter, you gain 10 out of combat MS plus 9 per stack. Great for any heavy roam-oriented champion. For example, Kiana, Fizz, Talia. And I get a lot of questions saying, why don't you go Relentless Hunter on Kiana? Yeah, that is a viable option. It's completely fine. But for me personally, when I'm heading into the side lane, because I don't build lifesteal within my kit, I want to be able to sell my Corrupting Pot and actually get the healing from Ravenous Hunter. And through an entire combo on an enemy. If I'm soaking up phase-checking damage to get onto the enemy, a lot of the time I'm very squishy. So I want any healing I can get, because that can potentially allow me to get in the fight, then get out. It's a feel thing at the end of the day, given like the way you like to play your champion. But I would highly recommend testing both. Does Relentless Hunter, do you feel like the movement speed is the difference between you getting those roams off or not? Or is the healing just feel so much nicer for you heading into mid to late game? I don't know. Must have a strategy in order to make this work, because again, it's very risky if you're not straight away knowing how you're going to utilize those rooms, and it's just not going to get much value from it. It's very good on support champions, or specifically those roamers. You see it a lot on champions like Bard or Pike or Nautilus, or very Alistar, very like roam-oriented supports, because even on Karma, I like it on Karma secondary, because like I just push in the wave and I can just roam with my Ghost Porros, sweep things, and just cause chaos on the map. Now, Ultimate Hunter, you guys probably have heard of this one, specifically in reference to my Nocturne guide. Great with champions that are very ultimate-centric. Your ultimate gains 5% reduced CD plus 4% per stack. Keynotes here, great for champions that revolve their entire identity around their ultimate, especially the high cooldown ones. The way CDR works in general is that CDR is more efficient, or more effective, with ultimates or abilities that have a long cooldown, because you're just shaving more off of it. So generally champions like Nocturne, Zed, and Ahri get a lot of value from this specific rune. Outside of that, there's not many champions that take it, so it is quite a niche rune choice, and I wouldn't recommend it. As like, it might sound cool in theory, like, oh cool, I'm playing Orianna, I want my ultimate off more, but when it comes down to it, a lot of the time you're just going to get a lot more value from Ravenous Hunter. So we finally made it to the sorcery tree, guys, and so for the sorcery tree, the way I like to view it is that it's the go-to mid lane mage tree. So if there's any tree that you're you're going to understand it's this one. This is where you really need to put the time in and really understand how it works at a very detailed level. And we're going to kick it off with Summon Airy. So damaging enemy champions with basic attacks or abilities deals damage to them with Airy. And conversely, empowering or shielding allies sends Airy to them, shielding them. The way I like to view Summon Airy is that it's like the mid lane mage equivalent to Halo Blades, where Halo Blades only procs off auto attacks, basic attacks, whereas Summon Airy procs off both abilities and basic attacks. So it's very, very good for a lot of mages who don't want to take fully committed fights. They just want to sit back, relax, poke, poke, poke with that low cooldown, very similar to Halo Blades, where it's short cooldown, go, go, go play style. So the main strength is that it's great for constant harass and trading for lane dominance. It really enables you to push the pace of the game, and it's very easy to proc, and it's very non-committal. So a lot of people like to contrast Airy with Electrocute, where Electrocute you need to trade aggressively, you need to go all in, burst combo, then get out. So it's very committal in a sense. Whereas Summon Airy, you can sit back, relax, cast your abilities. You don't need to use all of your abilities, you can just use one. So if you're playing Zoe, if you want to play very non-committal style, you can sit back, relax, poke Q, auto attack. You don't need to go in crazy and stay in the fight for a long time to actually get the 3 stacks. You can just sit back and just hit the Q and get a decent amount of damage off. So it's a very non-committal rune. And it's good in both high range and low range matchups. So if you're versing, say you're playing Zoe versus a very low range matchup like Fizz, players like Caps really like Summon Airy because you can constantly harass with auto attacks. But also in high range matchups, some people also like Airy because you know it's very non-committal and you're not really going to get in range to get 3 stacks to proc something like Electrocute, so you can sit back, relax, poke with Q. Now, something to think about, and for those of you, I get asked this question a lot, is like, what's the difference? What makes certain champions take Summon Airy versus Arcane Comet? Where the main response I say is if you have a champion with very low cooldowns, or maybe you're in a matchup where you know that you can abuse auto attacks or it's going to be a lot of constant trading, then Summon Airy generally is quite a lot better. But if you're playing, I guess, off high cooldown abilities, you're playing Victor and you're not really going to get into range for Q and auto attacks, you're just going to poke with E and play with your E cooldown, then you're generally going to be taking Arcane Comet, because Arcane Comet has a higher cooldown but it has higher base damage. But because you're not going to be able to you're not going to be proccing with Summon Airy with auto attacks all the time, you just get a lot more value out of Arcane Comet. So, you generally want to be taking Summon Airy with champions with low cooldowns who want to harass often, like Zoe Q auto attack, Ori Q, Syndra Q, Victor Q auto. Great with champions that have both utility and damage abilities. Champions like Orianna, Lulu, and Karma, who all have shielding abilities, so they get a lot of value from Airy as well. Now, for weaknesses. It does not scale well, so if you're not really trying to push the pace of the game, then I would not recommend Summon Airy. Conversely, if maybe you want to scale more and maybe you don't want to all in on the early laning phase, then you'd probably be looking for something like a Phase Rush. It has lower base damages than Electro and Comet, so if you are looking for those like burst oriented trades, then you probably are better off with something like Electrocute or Comet, Arcane Comet. It's really not good for 2v2s because, as we know, I've said this a lot throughout this video, 2v2s all about burst and having the higher amount of burst damage, because generally the jungler's coming in, you need to go, there's a short window to do something. So that's why Summon Airy is really not good for 2v2s. It's more for an extended lane 1v1. You don't really want to be taking it when you can't constantly harass with auto attacks or have high cooldowns. So maybe you're versing a long range champion where you're happy to just take it slow, harass from a distance, that sort of thing. Or maybe you can't maintain priority in the matchup. So Airy is really bad on the back foot. So if you're getting pushed in constantly, it's going to be really hard for you to find an opportunity to aggressively auto attack the enemy or poke the enemy, because you're going to be using your abilities and your auto attacks on the wave. So if you're versing a champion, like say you're versing a Victor, and for some reason you're playing a matchup, or like you're playing Syndra and you're just constantly pushing, or maybe you're playing like Vel'Koz into Victor, and you're like pushing the Victor in constantly, that can be a really good way to nullify Summon Airy, because then the Victor's going to have to use auto attacks and abilities on the wave, Qs on the wave, rather than you. So it's a really great way to nullify summon Aerie. So now for Arcane Comet, which is personally one of my favorite runes in the entire game. Really, really fun to use, where damaging a champion with an ability hurls a comet at their location, and if Arcane Comet is already on cooldown, if you hit an enemy, it actually reduces its cooldown. So it goes from a 20 to 8-second cooldown, and the main strengths of Arcane Comet is that it's a very high damage rune. It's great for bursting opponents, it's great for those short trades, and it's a very non-committal version of Electrocute, where, you know, you're doing it occasionally, but the difference is this time you're proccing it off one ability comparatively to Electrocute, where it's 3 abilities. So it's a little bit more reliable for a lot of those, I guess, long-range champions that can't go into the fight and fully commit in a way and kind of sit back and relax. It scales very well in extended team fights with constant damage. So not many people know this. If you're playing something like Annie and you got Tibbers within a team fight, AoEing people with the Thornmail damage or whatever, with the AoE with Rylai's and Leandries, that sort of thing, slapping people over time, if the people don't actually kill the Tibbers, it can actually, as you're going to proc that first initial Arcane Comet when you use the Tibbers on the enemy, but as it stays in the fight longer and longer, it's going to be consistently reducing the cooldown of Arcane Comet because you're constantly damaging the enemy, which sometimes leads to getting Arcane Comet off cooldown 3 or 4 times within a team fight. So not many people talk about it, but it's actually really, really solid in those long extended team fights, and it actually scales really, really well, especially with Rylai's or slows in general. That's why it works really well with Victor, because your third Hex Core actually gives you slows. So whether you're in a team fight with your R, you can get multiple procs of Arcane Comet. It slows them, which increases the chances of actually hitting the Arcane Comet as well. Great for 2v2s, especially when one of you has hard CC, which increases the chances of actually hitting or landing the Arcane Comet. It synergizes with any champion with high cooldown poke abilities, whether it's like your Xerath, your Vel'Koz E, a Victor E, Vel'Koz Q, that sort of thing. Basically, any long-range champion that doesn't really want to fully commit, just sit back, relax, poke from a distance. Useful in non-committal matchups. That's why you generally see Arcane Comet as well in, say, Azir versus Xerath, right? Or if Azir is versus some form of a poke mage, Azir's not going to be constantly committing to a fight because he's not going to be able to get in range. So Azir needs to sit back, Q from a distance, proc the Arcane Comet, and then play very, very slow, or play that way, non-committal wise. Otherwise, if Azir's constantly walking up, then he's going to take all this poke damage, he's going to get in range too often, and then Azir's just slowly going to lose the lane. So you generally see Comet in a lot of these non-committal matchups. Great against low engage compositions, again, because if you're versing a low engage composition, you can sit back, relax, constantly poke, get that extra Arcane Comet damage. You generally want to be taking this when you want short burst trades as well. If you want to be constantly trading and going again a constant harass, then this is probably not the rune for you, because then you should probably go Aerie or something like that. The main weaknesses is that it can actually be really difficult to land the Comet versus good opponents. Versus good opponents, I'll actually juke or dodge the Comet and make sure they don't take that extra damage. So it is a lot more effective, in my opinion, in lower elos, because they just very rarely dodge it. That's something to think about. It is harder to proc because it only procs off abilities. It doesn't proc off auto attacks. And a lot of those long range abilities are not point and click. They are skill shots. So if you miss your skill shots, then you're really going to not get much value. And that's why I think this is a very high skill cap rune, actually, because if you're very good at Victor and you land like 3 E's in a row and you time it with Arcane Comet, you can actually completely chunk out the enemy. But if you miss all of them, you don't get any value from it. You just kind of get completely screwed over. The third weakness here is that it actually has a high cooldown in the early game, something to think about. So if if the enemy dodges it, or you don't really find a way to utilize it, that sort of thing, you got to be making sure you're using it basically off cooldown because of how high that cooldown is. And it offers no utility. It's a rune that offers no utility, so that is a massive weakness of it. It's pure damage. You don't really want to be taking it when you want to play that constant harass style with low cooldowns, like I said, or if you're versing dive-oriented compositions. If you're versing dive-oriented compositions, you probably might want more of a utility rune. You might want something like Phase Rush, or some form of protection, or even Unsealed Spellbook or something like that gives you a little bit more utility, because again, a lot of these champions that do utilize Arcane Comet have no mobility within their kit. Xerath, Vel'Koz, Victor, they have no mobility within their kit, so they need to be careful when you do take it. And that's also why champions like Victor, if you are versing low threat compositions, I do really like Comet, but conversely, you're versing a very high threat composition, I would go Phase Rush. So, generally, I like to always think about each game going into it. Can I get away with it? Can I not get away with it? Now, Phase Rush. Now, this is, I would say, the flavor of the season. This is probably one of the most popular runes this entire season. I guess what people have realized with Phase Rush is that it's so versatile, which is one of the main strengths. It's extremely versatile, both offensively and defensively. So Phase Rush, basically hitting an enemy with 3 separate attacks or abilities within 4 seconds, grants movement speed and slow resistance, more effective for melee champions, got a 15-second cooldown. Now, people realize, well, I can use this for aggressive short trades. Like what I can do as Syndra, I can, QE W or just even like QE auto attack, back out, run away, and there's no counterplay. Same thing with a lot of these champions like Orianna. I can go for like a QWE or QW auto attack trade and then run away and dodge their skill shots. So it's very good offensively, but we know defensively, you're getting dived on by a champion. You can just proc it quickly, whether it's using your combo with an auto attack, run away, reposition, get into another position where you don't necessarily have to rely on your flash to reposition, and then you can continue to do damage. So it's a very, very versatile rune, and it's great for short burst trades, like I said. Scales insanely well because of how versatile it is at basically any portion of the game. Similar, what was that other rune I was talking about? Lethal Tempo, where it's very rare that you get a rune that is literally useful in every element, every portion of the game. It's very rare that you get a rune that is good in early game, mid game, and late game. Usually they have an identity at one portion of the game. But this is just so incredibly versatile. It's literally good from level 3 to level 18, which is ridiculous. Amazing at nullifying slow, so any slow-oriented team composition, you're versing a lot of slows, it's very, very valuable. Something to also think about as well, when you're playing any champion that does not have mobility built into your kit, it can basically it enables you. So the way Riot balances champions is that certain champions in order to give trade-offs. So for example, Syndra and Orianna and Cassio, they have a lot of raw damage, a lot of utility, a lot of amazing abilities. But to contrast that, they are mobile. They have no dashes. Yes, Cassio has a bit of movement speed. Orianna has a little bit of movement speed. But they have no terrain scaling. They have no jumps, blinks, that sort of thing. Which is fair, right? You can't have a champion that does ridiculous damage, has really good range, and has mobility. But what Phase Rush does, it really covers for those weaknesses without taking away from their offensive capability. So this is why Phase Rush is such an incredibly great rune. Great with champions that lack mobility, effective against high threat compositions where, as well, if you're versing any high threat composition where maybe you don't feel comfortable positioning in lane or posturing aggressively to poke the enemy, then you just scale with Phase Rush. It's completely fine. And it's good when you can't really bully your enemy in lane due to threat from jungle or you're in a really hard matchup. Now, for weaknesses, it offers no damage. So your laning is usually weaker as a principle. Like, you would probably take better trades a lot of the time if you had Aerial Comet or Electrocute or something like that, something to think about. And it's also hard to use. It's not sexy. Again, a lot of people when they create rune pages, especially the lower elo players, are like, I see damage, I want that one. Because Comet's cool. I want to hurl a massive Comet towards someone, that sort of thing. But Phase Rush is just movement speed. That's not sexy. I don't want movement speed. So, it's that's what people think. But it does have a very high skill cap, which is a weakness, I would say, for a lot of people, because if you don't utilize it properly, so you're just using it for the sake of using it, or you're not saving it for a specific moment, or you're getting the movement speed, but you're not utilizing it in a way to optimize your trading, and you're just not going to get any value from it. So a lot of the time, I don't recommend Phase Rush for lower elo players. And a lot of the time, people don't know how to gank and close the gap properly, so you're just going to get more value from Aerial Comet anyway. You must trade aggressively to utilize it. Again, you need to get in range a lot of the time to utilize it. If you're looking to utilize it aggressively, or offensively, you must trade or posture very aggressively, which can be a little bit risky sometimes, especially if you get locked down versus hard CC champions. You don't want to take it when you don't need the self-peel. So maybe you're versing a very low threat, linear, obvious composition with very low engage. Sometimes taking Phase Rush is a little bit over the top. You don't need it. And if you want to be a hardcore lane bully, then it's not something that you would opt in for. That's when you would opt in for the Airy, the Electrocute, that sort of thing. And if you're a low healer, like I said, I probably wouldn't recommend it. Now for the next row here, we have Nullifying Orb. When you take magic damage that will reduce your HP below 30%, gain a shield that absorbs magic damage based on level. It's got a 60-second cooldown, which is a very long cooldown. It's basically only useful when you're countered in lane and you need it to survive. If you don't need Nullifying Orb to survive, then you should never be taking it. Because, again, Mana Flow and Nimbus Cloak are such valuable rune choices that it's such a niche thing. It's like if you don't need it, don't take it. That's the philosophy with Nimbus Cloak, Nullifying Orb, essentially. So any champion, I guess, that really needs to burst you, that really want to abuse you at level 6, maybe you're hardcore counted and you literally can't survive at level 6, then it can be somewhat effective. That's why sometimes when I'm playing like Ari versus Syndra, or like you're versing a Fizz or versing a Diana, it can be a little bit useful. But even then, Nimbus Cloak's so OP right now, and Mana Flow is so damn reliable that I just don't recommend Nullifying Orb majority of the time. And like I said here, very niche choice due to how weak it is comparatively. Now, Mana Flow Band. Hitting an enemy with an ability permanently increases your max mana up to 250. After 250, restore 1% missing mana every 5 seconds. So this is probably one of the most reliable runes in the entire game. This is what makes this one of the main reasons that Sorcery Tree is so ridiculously strong, especially for mages, that mana is just amazing. Mana is everything. Mana is not just offense, it's defense. It's such an annoying stat to build sometimes, especially when you just want raw damage. And the great thing about Mana Flow Band, right? Let's just say you come back with a bit of gold. And you go back to base with a bit of gold. And you have a choice. Do I want to go Sapphire Crystal or do I want to go to an Amplifying Tomb? If you feel like you have Mana Flow Band, sometimes you can just get away with going straight into the Amplifying Tomb instead of the Sapphire Crystal. But if you didn't go Mana Flow Band, you're not going to have enough mana to utilize the AP, so you're going to have to go Sapphire Crystal. So sometimes little build optimizations, that sort of thing, Mana Flow Band can be really good. And especially with Azir, a lot of Azirs really like Mana Flow Band because you don't necessarily build Lost Chapter all the time. A lot of these Azirs don't. They just go straight into Nash's, into Liandry's or Rylai's or whatever they want to build. They don't want to build mana. So Mana Flow Band can get them through the early lane until they do get to their blue buff, in which mana is not really a problem. So Mana Flow Band is very, very valuable. Like I said, playing aggressive and defensively, it's great. Allows for more ability usage in the early lane, which leads to pressure, because more mana, which means more abilities, which means more pressure. Or defensively, more mana means more abilities to thin the wave, which means taking less damage. Or giving less priority to the enemy. Must be procced as early as possible in lane in order to utilize the second half of the rune, which is, after getting 250, you restore 1% of missing mana every 5 seconds. Now for Nimbus Cloak. Now, again, this was, I guess, flavor of the season. People realized how it did get a buff at one point. I can't remember when it specifically got a buff. But when this got buffed, people realized how OP. I would say this is genuinely OP. I know it's got a recent nerf, but even then, the function of this ability, this rune, it's literally changed League of Legends forever. Or like, not forever because it's probably going to change it, but it literally changed League of Legends for this entire season. Now, you may ask, why is that the case? Well, if you think about it, like I said before, in League of Legends or Riot, when they design champions, there's always trade-offs, right? Let's actually talk about jungle champions for a second. You got champions like Graves, right? You got a champion like Graves. Now, Graves as a champion, it has a whole lot of damage. It has a decent amount of utility. Its mobility is okay because it does have a little dash with the E, but a lot of the time, because he's so low range, he builds a lot of these damage items. One of the biggest drawbacks of Graves is that he gets kited. He gets kited very easy. His ganks were underwhelming because he couldn't really close the gap reliably enough. He doesn't have any hard CC, so he struggled. But then what happened, people realized, wait, I can just smite a minion or smite the enemy. I slow them with the chilling smite and I get the movement speed, which makes up for largely my lack of gap closing ability. It makes up for my lack of hard CC because then I can just stand next to them, order them down. It's absolutely ridiculous. So as you can see, Nimbus Cloak, what it actually does, it enables so many champions that would have otherwise been ignored. A lot of these champions that don't have mobility in their kit became OP in the meta because of Nimbus Cloak, simply because of Nimbus Cloak. And on top of that, there are a lot of other champions that get a lot of value from it because it synergizes so well with Unsealed Spellbook, and a lot of champions that just lack gap closing abilities. So any champion that lacks gap closing abilities loves Nimbus Cloak. That's why as well Galio loves it, right? Because ever since they removed the ability to flash or W flash, you can just TP in or you heal, get the extra movement speed from the Nimbus Cloak, which allows you to avoid using E to get into the fight because you want to start the fight with W as Galio, the taunt, then E to chain CC and get the full combo. Because if you're starting the fight with E, then you do the W, then they can just flash away, or it's really unreliable, or then even then there's no way of locking them down after you get the taunt. So that's why Nimbus Cloak is insanely amazing rune. Synergizes with Unsealed Spellbook because you get way more access to summoner spells. Very versatile summoner both offensively and defensively. Amazing skirmishing rune because again, movement speed allows you to dodge skill shots or close the gap, stick on the enemy, use more abilities on them, or get in range to auto attack them when you wouldn't have otherwise been. And like I said, enables champs with no gap closes. Now, next row, Transcendence. Gain 10% CDR when you reach level 10. Each percent of CDR exceeding the CDR limit is converted to Adaptive Force. So, amazing rune for a wide range of champions given how strong CDR is as a stat. CDR, again, is one of those amazing stats within the game. It's just so versatile. It doesn't matter. Like, every champion in the game benefits from CDR. And a lot of the time, because you either want damage or defensive capability, like, it feels really awkward to build CDR sometimes because you just want damage or defensive stats. You don't want to build CDR. So yes, a lot of the best items have inbuilt CDR, but CDR in general, if you can get it for free from a rune, it's just OP. So a lot of the people, this is one of the main reasons as well, people spec specifically into Sorcery Tree because they get access to things like Nimbus Cloak, Mana Flow Band, Transcendence. Already you can start to see this comparatively to the Domination Tree. It's already shitting all over the Domination Tree. Keynotes here, amazing rune for a wide range of champions, like I said, gives you flexibility and itemization as well, because you don't necessarily have to build CDR if you didn't want to, that sort of thing. Because again, there are some items that you want to build, but you maybe you can't because you really need CDR. Maybe you want to build Rylai's, or maybe you want to build Morello's, or maybe you want to build Leandri's or something like that. Scales incredibly well. It's very common choice in the secondary tree because, you know, obviously CDR. So a lot of people, what they do is they just only spec into secondary sorcery just for Transcendence. Really, really amazing. Especially as well, champions with Azir. Azir doesn't want to build a lot of these early CDR items. They don't want, I guess, they get Nashes, but after that, they want Leandri's a lot of the time, or Rabadons, or Rylai's. This is where Transcendence really comes into play. Celerity, all movement speed bonuses are 7% more effective on you and gain 1% movement speed. So, Celerity is very, very weak rune. Very weak rune. It's only decent when combined with Water Walking, the other rune I'll talk about in a bit. And champions that have MS buffs built in within their kit, which is, there's not many of them that really have one reliable or useful enough to warrant this specific rune. It does synergize, you know, quite well with Phase Rush. It is a very niche rune. It's only taken on roamers or very mobility heavy champions like Ryze, who have a considerable amount of MS built in with their kit. It's really not traditionally a mid lane rune. It's generally seen in the jungle, but even then I hate taking it on junglers. That's just my personal take. Nathan might roast me for that, I don't know. But then we've got Absolute Focus here in the third row. While above 70% HP, gain Adaptive Force bonus based on level. Now, again, this isn't really a common rune due to how unreliable it is, and because League of Legends is literally all about trading. Yes, it can be valuable. It's a very early, if you're in a very favorable matchup where you significantly outrange the opponent, and you want early strength within the laning phase, Absolute Focus can be useful. Sometimes you see it with champions that just want to completely dominate your opponent with the first few levels, pre-first base. So if you're playing something like a Karma support into like a melee that has like an Alistar or something that you can just tether and they can never really get onto, or even like something with way less threat than that, like even a Lulu that can't really poke you back, you can just sit back, take Absolute Focus, poke, and because they can't really trade much damage with you because you outrange, then you can get a bit of value. I did take this a little bit on Galio because I felt like I was always so healthy with my passive magic shield plus having corrupting pot, that sort of thing, or plenty of pots. I just felt healthy all the time. Like, you can do it for the one-shot combos, but it is a very unreliable rune because of how, you always trade in League of Legends. So it's very much an early lane rune. It's not necessarily a mid-game rune. Especially if you're in a very one-sided matchup, you want to play as much as a lane bully as possible and create a lead. Does not scale well at all. Now for the next row, guys, we have Scorch. Your next damaging ability, hit, sets the enemy on fire, dealing magic damage on a 10-second cooldown. Amazing early lane rune. Great if you're looking to be a potential lane bully. Only worth taking if you're really trying to push the pace of the game and get things done. Look to heavy trade early, tempo base for an early dark seal. Get things done, push the pace of the game. Not worth taking if you're looking to sit back, relax, play to your spikes, minimize. It scales extremely poorly. And it is quite easy to proc within those low range matchups, but if you are in some of those higher range matchups where either it's hard to get in range to actually hit them in the first place, then Scorch isn't for you. Generally, the way I like to view it is if you are not literally proccing it off cooldown, off this 10-second cooldown, then it's just not worth taking whatsoever. Water Walking, another pretty subpar rune. Generally not really a mid lane rune unless, like, a lot of junglers do take it. Yes, you can take it if you're taking celerity and you are looking to roam a lot and play for those rim of skirmishes, which does work in those aggressive servers like Korea and China. But for NA, EU, OS and things like that, I mean, yes, I guess EU can be quite aggressive in the higher elos, but for the majority of the players, they're not going to get too much value from this. Plus, I would just prefer the lane strength. Like, if I did want that extra like strength in the early portion of the game, I would just go Scorch. I feel like I'd create more of a lead 1v1. That's just my personal philosophy. But anyway, it's useful on champs that want to river skirmish and are really trying to push the pace of the game. Solid on any roaming oriented champion like Ryze. Can be utilized more reliably if you are duo with a jungler, because then you can like communicate saying, okay, there's going to be a 2v2 skirmish on the scuttle, you need to be there, or we're like playing for a very chaotic 2v2, then waterwalking can be decent. Again, not traditionally a mid lane rune. Now for Gathering Storm, every 10 minutes gain AP or AD. It's the best scaling rune in the entire game. Great when you see the team comps being quite farm oriented, or when you want to take the lane relatively slow. You can't reliably proc Scorch. You just want to default, minimize, scale, that sort of thing. Like I said here, synergize well in lanes that are not heavy trading. It doesn't really become impactful until 30 minutes, so you should really use this as a guideline to determine whether it's worth opting in for. You've got to be quite careful with taking Gathering Storm, because in higher elo games, it feels like they're just determined in the first 15 minutes. But in lower elo games, it feels like they always go to 30 minutes plus. So if you're in lower elo, Gathering Storm is a very valuable rune. But in higher elo, I'd be a little bit more careful with how often you take it. Now for the Resolve tree, guys. Finally made it to the Resolve tree. Now, just a quick note before we get into the details of this one. I need to talk about this tree not really through the lens of a mid laner, but more through the lens of a top laner or a support, because mid laners very rarely take any of the, especially the main keystones within the Resolve tree. So the way I like to view this in terms of a mid laner is that it's more of a defensive secondary tree. It's very rarely you take it as the primary main tree. So Grasp of the Undying here. Every 4 seconds in combat, your next basic attack will deal bonus magic damage equal to 4% of your max HP, heal you for 2% of your max HP, and permanently increase your HP by 5. Everything is reduced by 40% for ranged champions. So you don't really see this too often on ranged champions. There was a niche strategy with like Caitlyn AD carry that took it, but it's very, very rare. I think like if you wanted to play for sustain, you would just play for like Fleet Footwork, but I don't really know that grass strategy too well on Caitlyn, so I won't talk too much about that. So strengths. Great lane sustain and bullying opponents with sustain long trades. It's not really great for short trades. It's good for long trades because you need to be in combat for a long period of time to even proc it. So it's like every 4 seconds in combat. So generally you see this on a lot of melee champions are constantly fighting. A lot of those melee tanks. It is flexible in how it can be used though. It can be solid both as a defensive reactive rune if someone's like constantly trying to engage on you, but both, conversely as an offensive aggressive rune as well if you want to be constantly skirmishing and fighting with the enemy as well. So you generally want to be taking it when you are constantly looking to trade in those tank oriented matchups, if you're a champion like Maokai, Sion or Ornn, especially when you're already building HP within your build, because obviously it heals you for max HP, that sort of thing. Weaknesses requires you to be in combat for an extended period of time. Therefore, you got to be a little bit careful, because if you're always fighting in the wave, then most likely you're going to be pushing. Because if you're not always pushing with Grasp of the Undying, then you're going to be taking a lot of minion damage. So if you really want to get max value out of Grasp of the Undying, you need to be autoing the wave down a lot to make sure you don't take too much minion damage. And because you're always fighting, you're most likely going to be taking minion aggro. It gets a little bit chaotic, so you're just going to be a little bit careful with wave manipulation if you are taking this specific rune. It is hard to reliably proc because of how often you need to be in combat, and it's rarely worth taking on ranged champions just because of how how much it is reduced for a lot of ranged champions. Plus, a lot of ranged champions don't build a lot of HP, so you don't get too much value out of that. You don't really want to take it when you don't get value from the entirety of the resolve tree. It's not one of those runes where you're like, wow, I really want grasp. Like, it's one of those runes where it's like, okay, I need to go into the resolve tree, but am I going to go Aftershock or am I going to go Grasp type thing? It's not really a rune where you really want to. You're just going into this rune tree for Grasp. It's kind of like something you just take on the back end type thing. If you aren't looking to proc it often, then again, I wouldn't really recommend this one. Now for Aftershock, guys, after immobilizing an enemy champion, increase your armor and MR by 35 plus 80% of your bonus resist for 2.5 seconds, then explode to deal damage around you on a 20-second cooldown. Main strength is that it's really good at mitigating heavy burst combos, scales well with champions that build resistances, and can create space and buy time for carries to follow up and win a fight. So generally you only see people taking Aftershock against heavy dive, burst oriented champions like Zed, like Fizz, like Kiana, because if you minimize or you mitigate that initial burst, then they have nothing. And you've got to be very careful when you take Aftershock, because if you're versing a lot of sustained damage champions, then what damage are you actually blocking in this 2.5 second window? You're not blocking dick all. Like, there's no point in taking it. So you got to be very careful when you take it. But when it is a good Aftershock game, it can feel incredibly strong as a rune. And you should only be looking to take it if you do have a reliable way to proc it with hard CC, and if you don't necessarily need the lane strength, then Aftershock can be quite good because it scales quite well into mid game, especially if you are building resistances naturally, sorry. And it can be great if you're just acting as that person, you're acting as the former frontline for your team. If you're not necessarily the key damage source, then your jungler's just going to play to other lanes, you're going to minimize, you can use this to minimize lane quite well as well, get to those team fights, act as the front line, that sort of thing. So generally a very defensive rune. Weaknesses, it has a high cooldown, so it can only be procced once reliably within a skirmish. So you've got to be quite careful with the way you use it. And it is only useful when timed with the enemy's key abilities. So if you're playing Galio, you go into the fight, you proc your Aftershock early in the fight, whether through your ultimate or through your W or whatever reason, you proc it, and they hold their abilities, then they use it after, it can be completely nullified. So you've got to be very careful with the way you actually use Aftershock. And if you're versing better players, they will understand that you've wasted it. Especially when you're in the laning phase. If you're playing Galio and then you E in or something like that, and then your Aftershock, or you use W and your Aftershock's on cooldown, the enemy mid laner, they'll wait that 2.5 seconds and then they'll start to use your abilities on you because you've just wasted your Aftershock. So you've got to be very careful with the way you're actually using it. It's quite a high skill cap rune as well. And it's not effective against sustained DPS, like I said. And it is very high skill cap. It isn't a simple rune to use. It's not for the average player. You've got to be very careful. If you do want a very easy to execute defensive rune, I mean, to be honest, there's actually no easy to execute defensive rune. This is probably easier than Grasp in a way, so you're just going to be quite careful and be quite cognizant of how to utilize it. You don't really want to be taking it if you don't have a reliable CC ability, or if you need the actual lane strength, or maybe you're getting played towards, your jungler's playing towards you, you're playing strong side, or maybe you already win the 1v1 and you're going to push your lead, then Aftershock's really not that amazing. And if you're not really getting targeted, you're not acting as the key frontline for your team, then you might as well just go something that's going to give more utility or more damage or provide more damage for your team. So it's not really good if you're not getting targeted. Now for Guardian, guys, guard allies within 350 units of you and allies you target with spells for 2.5 seconds. While guarding, if you or the ally take more than a small amount of damage, you are both shielded for 1.5 seconds. So generally you only see this in bot lane. It's a very support heavy rune, purely because you need to be in range of an ally to get use out of it. So it's not a solo lane rune. So it is very effective during the early lane 2v2 burst oriented 2v2s. For example, when you're versing champions like Ali, Leona, Thresh, and they go onto your AD carry or they go onto you, you're going to get that shield. It's going to really help you minimize and potentially win that trade. And it's also decent for 3v3s, because 3v3s aren't necessarily about burst. 3v3s, because there's so much self-peel, it's more about sustained damage, self-peel and utility and CC. When to take it, you only want to be taking it in bot lane due to how guard works. When you can't reliably proc Aftershock, maybe you don't have too much hard CC, or even if you do have hard CC but you're not going to be using it too often aggressively, or you want more self-peel for your AD carry in more difficult matchups, it is less of a scaling rune. It is very much more for lane. Weaknesses, it is very hard to proc out of lane due to the distance you need to be with from your teammates. It is very bad against poke, because if you're versing a poke champion, they can just sit back, they can poke you from a distance, proc it, and then they can just go in after, or they can just constantly harass you. You're not really mitigating any damage. So it's very much not good into poke. Has a high cooldown and only a laning rune. Don't take it when you're the main engager for your team, because then you're going to be so split from your teammates. It doesn't even matter. At that point, you need to be as tanky as possible. Then you probably should be taking Aftershock. Or if you know the lane is relatively even and you don't necessarily need the self-peel for your AD carry, then again, you're just going to get way more value from Aftershock. When you're versing range supports, like I said before, they can easily break it, so you're not going to get much value from Guardian. Now for the first row within the Resolve tree, guys. The first one we have is Demolish, which is actually probably one of my personal favorite runes in the entire game. Sometimes I just like speccing into Resolve purely for Demolish. I'll go one defensive durability row, whether it's Bone Plating or Second Wind, and then I'll round it out with Demolish, because it's just such a versatile rune. Charge up a powerful attack against a tower for 3 seconds. The charge attack deals 100 bonus physical damage plus 35% max HP. And again, I really like it because it's great at pushing the pace of the game. If you have a lead, it's great. If your jungle comes to you, it's great. And it's very, 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 very versatile, because you can use it reactively and proactively, in the sense that if your enemy takes a really poor base, you can just punish it by breaking a free plate, or, you know, continuing to stay in lane and proc it even twice if they take a bad TP or a bad roam or something like that. It's even good even if you're TPing to another lane, you're playing a top laner and then you TP bot, you're playing a mid laner and you TP bot, you get a double kill or get one kill, the enemy is like gone out of lane, you can stay there and just, you know, get 2 plates when you would have only got 1, that sort of thing. So it's really good at pushing the pace of the game. And as we know, if you can break the first 3 plates of the game, then get Rift Herald, and then use the Rift Herald for the last 2 remaining plates, then it's basically GG. You can always then snowball from that moment. So I really, really like Demolish. And the last point there was, if you receive a gank, sometimes that can give you enough room to proc it on the tower as well. Really, really solid. The next one is Font of Life. This is a very strange rune. Impairing the movement of an enemy marks it for 4 seconds. Allies who attack that target heal themselves. It's great in 2v2s, generally taken only as a support rune, especially on champs like Taric, Nautilus, Alistar, that sort of thing. And it is really effective when you have a lot of auto attackers on your team. So if you have a team where you got Jace, you got Lucian mid, you got a lot of auto attack based champions, then it actually can be quite valuable in those team fights. You need to be reliably able to proc it, since it doesn't have a cooldown. That is something to note as well. And if you're not procking it reliably, then you're not going to get much value from it. Now, Shield Bash. While shielded for 1 to 10, while shielded, gain 1 to 10 armor and magic resist based on level. Whenever you gain a new shield, your next basic attack against a champ deals bonus adaptive damage. Now, this is a very low value rune. I believe it's actually taken way too much. People think it's good because it like sounds cool, but it's actually very low value. There aren't many champions in the game that can utilize it, so it is a very niche rune. The only main champions that can use it outside of mid are like Shen, Camille, Karma, although Karma can use it mid. But if you're playing Karma mid, it's very rare that you're speccing into Resolve secondary anyway. But it is very much like a top rune, I would say. Very, very niche rune. Not really something that I would recommend unless you're playing Shen or Camille. Because a lot of the time, if you're speccing into Resolve, as these champions, it's either a secondary where you're going, if you're going secondary for bone plating, or if you're here at this point, you might as well go like demolish. I feel like you just get a lot more value from that. Now for the next row, we have conditioning here. After 12 minutes, gain +9 armor, +9 magic resist, and increase your armor and magic resist by 5%. Key notes here, great scaling rune, only really worth taking when you are building resistances, only worth taking in easy matchups where you don't necessarily need the lane durability, because this row is predominantly all about lane durability from second wind and bow plating. I mean, yes, it can be taken in top lane in some easy matchups. It's very, very rare this is taken outside of top lane. Yes, it can be taken in support in some moments, actually, but support is more of a heavy trading style of 2v2 lane, so it's very rare that you won't need second wind or won't need bone plating. So for second wind, now this is very important. These are two runes. Second wind and bone plating are two runes that you really need to understand well. So after taking damage from an enemy champion, heal for 4% of missing HP +6 over 10 seconds. So if you are attacked while already under effect, it will actually refresh. This is actually one of my favorite runes in the entire game for minimizing tough, constant poke lanes. So maybe you're playing Galio versus Victor. This is actually where one of the biggest rune mistakes actually occur, where people default to bone plating when they're in these heavy poke matchups. They just see bone plating, defense, I want to go bone plating. No, a lot of the time you actually get way more value from second wind. It can get procced so often, especially in those poke-oriented matchups. Not effective against burst-oriented high cooldown champions. If you're versing like a Zed, a Fizz, something like that, you're going to get a lot more value from bone plating. And like I said, it's probably one of the most reliable runes in this entire row, and it synergizes very well with Doran Shield. So if you spec into Resolve and you start with Doran Shield and you have second wind, you're like never going to die. That's why you see sometimes Akali players start Doran Shield in a hard matchup with second wind secondary, or Conqueror or secondary Resolve with second wind or bone plating, especially second wind. It is ridiculous. Like, it's so hard to actually kill the Akali. Now, bone plating. After taking damage from an enemy champion, the next 3 spells or attacks you receive from them deal less damage. Great against any burst, heavy champion that really tries to one rotation you. So champions that really struggle to pop it first, then go in. So champions that are really, one combo oriented, like Fizz, Zed, Talon, the cooldown is high, so you have to be very careful about getting proc. So the higher elo you get, people will actively think about proccing it, then engaging first. Because if you just engage with bone plating up, they're really not going to be able to win that trade very reliably. So that's something you also got to take into account as well. And damage is only minimized from the first target that hits you guys. Very, very important to understand. So it's actually not that good for 2v2s. Because if you think about it, you get it procced by the mid laner, then the jungle comes. The jungle does full damage. So maybe you're versing like something, you're versing a mid laner with an Elise jungle. The mid laner procs it, then the jungle comes. It's not absorbing any damage. That's why it's also not really good in team fights either. That's another reason why I think second wind is a little bit better as well. So that's something you really need to think about. Like, people don't know that. It's a very important distinction to make. Now for the last row, the final row within the Resolve tree here, we have Overgrowth. Absorb life essence from monsters or enemy minions that die near you. Permanently gain 3 HP for every 8. Once you absorb 120, gain an additional 3.5% max HP. It's only really good when roughly you get to around 2000 HP. That's like the number that really makes it worth taking. It is a solid scaling rune, but it's very unreliable for junglers because you just don't kill enough monsters. And it's also not good for roaming supports because if you're playing a roaming support, it's very likely that you're just sitting in lane killing the enemy. You're most likely pushing and moving and potentially giving your AD carry a lot of solo XP, and they're killing minions by themselves. So you got to be careful when you take Overgrowth. Revitalize, I really don't like Revitalize. Again, a relatively weak rune. Heals and shields you cast or receive are 5% stronger and increased by an additional 10% on targets below 40% HP. It's only good when you actually have healing inside of your kit and build lifesteal, or if you just heal others. So if your only healing comes from lifesteal, then Revitalize is not worth it. And it's not even worth it on champs like Aatrox. Like, even on Aatrox, a lot of the time, Overgrowth is just going to be more valuable because you build HP on Aatrox anyway. And the healing is so little that, yeah, again, it's just, you're getting such little value from Revitalize. And it is So overall, it's just a very, very niche rune, mainly a support rune, mainly for champions that very much revolve around heals. They have heals within their kit, and supports that actually heal other champions like Soraka and Sonar and things like that. So unflinching. Gain 10% tenacity, 10% slow resist. These values increase up to an additional 20% tenacity and 20% slow resist based on missing health, max value at 30% HP, great against heavy CC compositions, useful if you're the main form of engage or any dive-oriented form of frontline, very good against high CC lanes like Renekton, and the main reason that's the case is because it's great when you're looking at the team composition and you see that you need tenacity, but you also want to build Tabis. So a champion like Renekton, for example, versing Renekton, you do want Mercs, or maybe you're versing like, you know, a lot of hard CC, but you're versing also like a Yasuo or an Illusion. It's like, I want Mercs, like versing an Ashe, for example. I want Mercs, but I want Tabis. I want both. This is where unflinching really comes into play, because then it makes you feel a little bit better. You're like, okay, I'm still getting the tenacity from unflinching, so I don't feel as bad for going Tabis. That is something to think about, and it's probably one of the biggest reasons that unflinching is a pretty decent rune. And again, as you can see, it's very situational. You wouldn't go unflinching every single game. This is where you need to adapt and assess the enemy team's composition. So we finally made it to the inspiration tree, guys. Now the inspiration tree is actually one of the most complex, misunderstood, utility heavy trees, and if you are a mid laner, it is incredibly important to understand this tree, because I would say 80% of the time, you're either speccing into it in your secondary or at least in your primary tree. So sit back, maybe take a few notes. This is probably worth your time. If you've just navigated to this video, it's probably a great choice. And the first rune we're going to kick off with is Glacial Augment. So basic attacking a champion slows them for 2 seconds. The slow increases in strength over its duration. Slowing a champion with an active item shoots a freeze ray through them, freezing the enemy ground for 5 seconds, slowing by 60%. Now for strengths. It's actually really amazing for increasing the chances of hitting other key hard to land abilities both for you and your team. So generally you see Glacial Augment taken on very skill shot oriented champions. That's why you see it on Zillion, Vel'Koz, Ahri, because without it, you're basically, it's like throwing a dart at a dartboard. It's very hard to hit these abilities, but if you do hit them, it can completely change the game. And if you do hit them, you don't really need a keystone to generate that threat, because they already do so much damage alone. It's also great for increasing gank threat on immobile champions, especially melees. So if you're versing a champion like Aurelia, Yasuo, something like that, they overextend in the lane, you pop your GLP or your Twin Shadows, they get slowed, then your jungler can actually come from a mile away without even necessarily having to use their gap closer, hold on to their gap closer, then use their gap closer to chase after they flash. So it is a very great form of gank threat, as well as if they don't use their flash, then you're just going to be able to land your key CC ability, whether it's Zillion Double Bomb, Ahri Charm, Vel'Koz E, that sort of thing, which again turns into an easy burst kill for you and your jungler. So it is very good for increasing gank threat, and it's amazing for picks and skirmishes in mid game. So if you are in an even state game, in mid game, you're versing whether they're mobile or ideally immobile champions, then a lot of the time this can be the difference between making something happen or not. So if you're in mid game, you're just looking for a pick around Dragon or something like that, you use your Twin Shadows, you spot someone out, you walk at them with your key ability, and then they either have to flash or they take the full combo to the face and die. So it's a really, especially when you're playing with your jungle in mid game, whether it's in the side lane or just in the enemy jungle, it's a really great way to look for a proactive play. So you generally want to take it when your abilities are normally very hard to land, like I said before, Vel'Koz, Ahri, Zillion, and if your team already has plenty of damage. So if you're playing Ahri and you have like a Kha'Zix jungle, you have an Aurelia Jax top lane or something like that, then a lot of the time Glacial Augment is quite good, because not only are you not having to necessarily be the main form of damage, you're also complementing all these other champions by allowing them to land their key abilities, or stick onto the opponent. But conversely, if you have a lot of tanks on your team, not a lot of damage, maybe you have like a set jungle, or like some form of tank jungle, a Mumu, whatever. And then you also have like a tank top lane, you have a Maokai and an Ornn or something like that. A lot of the time, if I'm playing Ahri, I'll just go Electrocute. Or if I'm going Vel'Koz, I'll just go Comet. I know that I need to be the main form of damage. I need to generate the threat. They're already going to offer the utility. So generally in mid-jungle, or just in general as a concept, You need some champions to offer utility in terms of hard CC, setup, that sort of thing. And then you need some champions that just offer raw damage. That's why in terms of building out a composition, whether you're playing Clash, whether you're playing competitive, you ideally want to have a combination of both. Because the way Riot, like I said before, the way Riot designed champions is some champions have a loaded kit filled with damage and just raw burst ability. But conversely, to round out and balance those champions, they won't have mobility, they won't have utility, or the abilities will be really hard to land. They'll just be skill shots. And then conversely, some champions have a lot of utility, hard CC and setup, but they don't have too much damage. That's why those two specific types of champions really mesh together well. That's also the reason why, in terms of when you playing a mid jungle combination, you have like a champion like one with a lot of hard CC and a lot of utility, and one with a lot of damage. That's why Galio is really great with a champion like Camille, or Galio with Kha'Zix, for example, or even like, you know, Rumble with some form of hard CC jungle or whatever. Those two really mesh well together. So in terms of weaknesses, guys, it really requires items to become useful. Until you get your GOP or your Twin Shadows, Glacial Augment really offers nothing, so your entire early laning phase is basically weakened. So it's way less damage than other rune choices. So you've got to really weigh this up. If you're playing Ahri or Vel'Koz or Zillion or whatever, you've got to make sure you reflect in the post-game thinking, did I get a lot of value out of Glacial Augment this game, or could I have just gone Comet? Could I have just gone Electrocute and had a lot more threat? Because you know you're actually going to either lose trades or take poor trades, or not be able to trade at all, knowing you have no extra damage within your early trading pattern. So that is something to think about. And it is harder to carry with the due to lack of burst threat. So if you're playing Ahri, it's not a 1v9 style of carrying a game. You need to make sure that you have plenty of damage in your comp to really close out that game. Don't take it when you need to be the carry damage-wise and your team already has utility. Or your abilities are relatively easy to land, then you don't need Glacial Augment. It's only something to complement these champions that have a lot of skill shots, that have abilities that are really hard to land. Obviously, there are exceptions. You know, you got niche champions like Sion who take Glacial, who can just stick on the enemy with the passive or things like that. But majority of the time, from a mid laner's perspective, that's the main thing to consider. Now for Unsealed Spellbook, one of my personal favorite runes, and what I believe to be one of the strongest runes in the entire game, where you swap one of your equipped summoners to a new single-use spell. Each spell you swap to permanently decreases the swap CD by 25 seconds. So, strengths. It scales amazingly because access to more summoner spells later in the game, given that each swap you've done as you get later into the game decreases the cooldown by 25 seconds. So you'll be able to just really swap through those summoners later into the game, get more access. And if you're getting access to things, especially with champions that can really utilize a bunch of differing summoners like TF and Galio, you got Galio with Nimbus Cloak who's able to filter through heal, barrier, exhaust, ignite, TP, like all Ghost. He can utilize all of them really well. So this is why on certain champions that can actually utilize Unsealed Spellbook, it scales amazingly. But conversely, if your champion doesn't use summoner spells that well, or you're very one-dimensional, maybe you're playing like an assassin, something like Zed or Fizz, those champions wouldn't work well with Unsealed Spellbook because they just wouldn't really utilize any other summoner outside of those aggressive burst ones. So just because it doesn't make sense with their identity as a champion. Other strengths here, it's super versatile, flexible in all types of games, both offensively and defensively. So again, if you get ahead with Spellbook, it can be really great because you can just swap to a more offensive style of summoner. Conversely, you get behind, you can just take barrier, you can just take heal, you can just take exhaust, cleanse. You can just take a more defensive summoner spell, so which is, you know, really I love having that flexibility within the game because you don't know what will happen in a specific game. It allows for creativity as well. You know, you're entering a skirmish, you may realize, oh, if I actually take heal here, I can save my opponent and they're not going to expect that, and then we're going to be able to turn the 2v2. Or I know the enemy doesn't have ignite here, so I can actually swap to heal, or I can swap my heal to barrier because I know they have ignite, or I can take ghost and get to this fight that I wouldn't have been able to get to, or they're actually doing dragon. If I actually ult in or as TF, I can smite it then get out. I've done that with Baron before. So there's actually really creative plays that you wouldn't have been otherwise able to do. You generally want to be taking Unsealed Spellbook if you need TP, but you want cleanse as well. This is actually what I do when I'm playing Orianna into TF. I really love taking Unsealed Spellbook because I want cleanse, because TF is literally a point and click stun champion, but I also want TP because if I don't take TP, TF can actually lock me in the early lane or get a really good tempo base and get a free roam off. But if I match TP in the early lane, then TF's never going to have enough priority to get that free level 6 roam off, which is really important to me, especially in high elo games where TFs are very good at utilizing that first Twist of Fate ultimate. If your champion can actually utilize multiple summon as well, champions like Zoe, TF, Galio, then Unsealed Spellbook is for you. That's also like why in top lane, Ornn really liked Unsealed Spellbook, because he's such a versatile champion, aggressively, skirmish-wise, defensively, can utilize so many of them. That's also why champions like Bard get a lot of, could potentially take Spellbook, because again, they're so versatile. When you're looking to take Nimbus Cloak, it's also really, really good because you just get more access to summoner spells. And when you really want to minimize early laning phase, like you're not necessarily playing to win lane, you're just playing to minimize, you're playing to scale, you're playing to get to your key spikes. That's where Unsealed Spellbook really comes into play. And also, like, if you're laning phase, maybe you're in a matchup where you can't punish too much, and you're like, screw it. Given the jungle matchup, given we have no gank threat on this guy, I'm just going to take Unsealed Spellbook and scale. Like, I don't necessarily need to take Airy or Comet here and just go play for kills or play for aggressive trades, and I don't need the self-peel from Phase Rush, and even if I had Phase Rush, it isn't going to give me the ability to take those offensively burst-oriented trades. Screw it. I'm just going to take Unsealed Spellbook, which a lot of the time is the case. Weaknesses. You must be out of combat to swap. That is something to think about. It's not available until 6 minutes, and that's on patch 10.15. I know that's getting changed at some point. You must swap 3 times before reselecting that spell, which is a bit of a kick in the nuts as well. So if you do want, heal, you're going to have to swap through 3 others just to even get to heal again. And it really doesn't really offer much lane strength at all. Offers no damage. So in terms of your trading patterns, nothing's helping you there. So when you do exit a game, you've got to make sure that you're contemplating and thinking about that after the game, thinking, well, if I had Airy, or if I had Comet, or if I had Electrocute, or even if I had Aftershock, what could have been different in this game? Would I have had priority in certain points? Could I have been able to push and move more? Could I have got things done? Would we have been able to win that early 2v2 skirmish? Would we have been able to double scuttle the enemy? Would I have got priority at this specific time if I had, whatever? So it is something to think about, and a lot of people kind of get obsessed with Unsealed Spellbook, and I'm guilty of that myself when, probably I should have taken something a little bit more aggressive. Don't take when you want to dominate lane, when your champion doesn't utilize multiple summoners like Zed or Xerath like that. Or if you really want to push the pace of the game and, speed it up, then you probably shouldn't be taking Unsealed Spellbook. The last one is, in terms of the keystones, is Prototype Omnistone. Now, I'll quickly talk about the description here. Periodically, you get a single use of another random keystone, 5 to 3 second cooldown between using a keystone and getting the next, 9 to 7 for ranged. After 40 seconds of not using, it will automatically reroll. Now, I'm actually pissed off at Riot. I actually feel like this keystone does not have a clear identity yet. Like, I feel like they needed to they felt like they screwed up with Kleptomancy. Like, alright, we screwed up with Klepto, we need to put in another weird rune into the game. I feel like this is going to get changed. I don't feel like this is going to be a rune that's going to stick around because it just doesn't have an identity. It just doesn't make sense. There's very little champions in the game or setups or builds or approaches to winning the game that can reliably use this specific setup. Yeah, really, and especially since Predator got nerfed, that was one of the main reasons why Omnistone was decent, because it gave you access to Predator. But when they removed that, or when they actually nerfed Predator, then Omnistone got indirectly nerfed hard. So I actually stopped taking Omnistone, doing this Omnistone TF setup ever since the Predator nerfs, because I just didn't feel like I got value from it. But anyway, strengths allows for creative playmaking, can create chaos in a game that otherwise would have been very slow and linear. And Predator, you still do get access to Predator, which means that it is good, because Predator is one of those things that a lot of people want to spec into, but you're just stuck with Predator. But if you just use it once, it can be a great one-off use type thing. But ever since the nerf, it's not an amazing strength anymore. Generally, you only want to be taking it when your champion actually synergizes with They're really great at skirmishing, and they have very versatile kits. That's why you saw like Bard and Twist of Fate take it, because they do have very versatile kits. Theoretically, you could take it on a champion like Galio as well. It is very similar to Unsealed Spellbook in a way, because it's very skirmish oriented. But again, Unsealed Spellbook is just a lot more reliable because you have access. You get to choose what rune, or you get to choose what you're getting, rather than Omniscience. You don't get a choice. Like in the early lane, you might just get stuck with Glacial, and it's like, oh, well, what am I going to do with Glacial? It's just like a complete waste. Or you get like Conqueror on like Twist of Fate mid. It's just like a waste of time. When you want to push the pace of the game by influencing the map and not the 1v1, it's really not a 1v1 rune. It's more of like a chaotic 2v2, 3v3 roam style of playing. It doesn't really give you any lane strength or reliable lane strength. Weaknesses: doesn't have much lane strength, is somewhat unreliable due to the random nature. Predator nerfs hurt it, pretty self-explanatory. Don't really take it when you want to dominate the lane and win trades 1v1. Don't take it when you want to play a slow, calculated, farm-oriented game. And don't take it if your champ is very one-dimensional and it needs to do one thing. Like, if you're playing an assassin, for example, Omnistone wouldn't make sense because you need access to Electrocute all the time, or you need access to, like that, press the attack or the Conqueror or whatever. Like, you can't afford to have things that are outside of your domain. Very one-dimensional kits would not work with Omnistone whatsoever. So, now for the first row within the Inspiration Tree. We have Hex Flash here. So while Flash is on cooldown, it is replaced by Hex Flash. Channel it for 2 seconds to blink to a new location. It's on a 20-second cooldown. Now, key notes here, synergizes very well with Nimbus Cloak because you still, proc Nimbus Cloak whenever you use Hex Flash. So that's why you see Hex Flash a lot with Set and Nimbus Cloak. It actually compensates for his lack of gap closer, and it synergizes very, very well. And also with his kit, because he gets the extra movement speed, so it really, really complements him to get in range to get his combo off. Great for champions that have hard CC and can surprise setup kills. This is why we actually saw Hex Flash a lot on champions like Alistar. They'll charge it up in the bush, surprise someone with a setup, like a surprise engage, CC, boom. And a lot of the time, that could actually close the gap. So if you're playing Alistar, they disrespect, you could actually Hex Flash into Q, run behind them, and then punt them back into your team, when if you didn't have Hex Flash, you wouldn't have that luxury. So it's actually a really good creative lane rune to get leads as these crazy engage supports. Useful for generating threat out of bushes, like I said. Even if, like some junglers as well, they just want to sit in the bush in the fog of war, utilize it, and then with Nimbus Cloak close the gap. And allows for creative playmaking in mid-game by going over terrain, or even early to mid-game where you're able to go over terrain that you wouldn't have otherwise. And you can catch people off guard going around specific areas of vision. If your kit maybe doesn't necessarily allow you to scale terrain, you go over Dragon Pit, you can go over certain walls, that sort of thing. Magical footwear. Oh, and actually one other thing about Hex Flash, what I've seen, some people with Hex Flash, they know that the river dot bush is warded, so they Hex Flash into the side lane bush, and then they wait, and then that sort of thing. But very, very niche creative things. Magical footwear. So this is actually probably one of my favorite runes in the entire game. One of the main reasons actually I spec into Inspiration a lot of the time. You get free slightly magical boots at 12 minutes, but you can't buy boots before then. Each takedown decreases it by 45 seconds. Slightly magical boots give you 10 MS. This is something that is really underrated. And I said here, the extra movement speed on slightly magical boots is very underrated for gap closing oriented champions. So whenever I'm playing basically any mid lane champion, like if I'm playing Twist of Fate and I get that extra movement speed, because you still get the extra movement speed even when you upgrade your boots, it can literally be the difference between getting that stun off or getting that extra bit of damage off. Even when I'm playing Orianna, again, I can tether a little bit easier. I can get in range for Q and do combos, and just in synergy, synergizes very well with Phase Rush in my opinion to get the combo. You really abuse your max range. People don't talk about that, but especially in combination with Time Warp Tonic, giving you the extra movement speed when you have Corrupting Pot and Time Warp Tonic as well, you get the movement speed as well. So all these little things can really add up to allow you to catch the enemy off guard. Saving 300 gold in the early game is the main reason this is such an OP rune, because a lot of champions, they really, really need to get to their first key item spike. For some people, it's Revolver at 1050 gold. For other people, it's Lost Chapter. For some people, it's even less than that. And what Magical Footwear actually allows you to do is get to that key item spike without having to spend gold, that 300 gold on your tier 1 boots. And because of how important movement speed is in the game, you always at least need tier 1 boots at some point. So when you go back to base, if you have 1300 gold and you don't have Magical Footwear, you're going to have your Lost Chapter, and then you're like, wait, now I have no movement speed for ages, because then I'm going to have to tempo reset again. But if you have Magical Footwear, by the time you get Lost Chapter gold, you don't feel guilty, because, all right, cool, I get my Lost Chapter, and then, you know, my boots are going to come online soon anyway. So, it's a very, very solid, reliable rune. But be careful when taking it in skill shot oriented matchups where you need to rush tier 1 or tier 2 boots. If I'm playing a matchup like Orianna into Syndra or something like that, a lot of the time I actually like to either rush Mercs, or if I'm versing a champion like Ari, any skill shot oriented champion, I either like to rush Mercs, or I like to sit at least on tier 1 boots, potentially even first base, to help me actually dodge those skill shots. So if you are in a very skill shot oriented matchup, both ways, so either you're hitting the skill shots or they're hitting the skill shots, this might kind of really shoot yourself in the foot, where that's where you would probably go perfect timing, because then that would allow you to really buy those early boots. Perfect timing. Begin the game with a commencing stopwatch that transforms into a stopwatch after 14 minutes. Each takedown you acquire reduces this timer by 120 seconds. It's a great alternative to Magical Footwear if you need the early boots, like I said before. This rune is actually kind of low value. Now, back in the day, before it got nerfed, it actually contributed more gold towards your Zhonya's. And on top of that, it actually gave you active item CDR. It actually gave you CDR for your Zhonya's. And I believe I think it was on the GA and the Stone Plate, Gargoyle Stone Plate as well. But I know 100% it was on the Zhonya's. So that was actually made it a very, 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 very valuable rune. And on top of that, I believe it actually came online earlier than 14 minutes, but then they nerfed it. So now it only contributes 250 gold towards Zhonya's. It doesn't give active item CDR anymore, and it comes online so incredibly late. So it's not a very valuable rune anymore. The only situation I take it is for this first one if I need the early boots. Otherwise, Magical Footwear for me just trumps it in like every single way possible. So that is something to think about. And another misconception about perfect timing, they think, oh, you know, I need to build Zhonya's. I'm versing an early assassin. I'm versing like a Zed or a Fizz. I need to buy early Zhonya's. But the thing is, it's like, it doesn't come online by the time you need it. By the time you need a stopwatch and you're versing a Zed, they hit level 6 way earlier by the time this comes online. Like, you're dead. Like, this doesn't offer any value. So it's like, oh, I might as well save the gold and build my Seekers. Screw the stopwatch. I'm not going to have it anyway, so screw that. Like, people don't realize how long this comes to take online. So, yeah, something to think about. So for the next row here, Futures Market on the left-hand side, you can enter debt to buy items. The amount you can borrow increases over time. This is a super underutilized rune in my opinion. Not many people talk about this rune, and it's something I want to riff on a little bit more next time I do my updated Victor guide. But for me, the way I view it, it's great for any champion that doesn't have tempo reset capability. If you're playing a champion like Victor, a lot of the time, you need to stay in lane for an extended period of time. It's really hard to tempo reset. You just want to continually stay in lane and poke. But, you know, and then champions that can tempo reset a lot, you know, they can get away without it. But because so many champions in the game are so incredibly item reliant rather than level reliant, they get a lot of value from this. So each time they go to base, they need to maximize the amount of items they get in that specific recall. So that's why it's so good for champions like Victor, especially because it's so hard to tempo reset, especially pre-first base where you haven't got that initial hex call, because before that you have like barely any wave clear, you have high mana costs, you basically lose most trades, you're kind of screwed in a lot of ways. So you know, taking it on Victor allows you to basically guarantee that first hex core upgrade, which can literally be the difference between you like winning the game or losing the game. So basically any champion that is incredibly item reliant all through the game. So a champion, even like a champion like Orianna, would probably get a lot of value from it, because it could actually help her get to Lost Chapter. But at that time, you're kind of sacrificing Biscuits and Magical Footwear, which are two incredibly crucial runes. So it's hard to justify, but you can kind of see where I'm coming from. And the only reason it isn't taken is due to the strength of other options, like I was saying before. Like, we'll talk about Biscuits in a second, but Biscuits is probably one of the most strong runes in the game right now, and it's probably been the meta for this entire season, actually. People are now realizing how strong that rune actually is. But Futures Market, it's good to think about. If you are playing any champion that really struggles to tempo base, and it is really good. Now, you may ask, actually, why do I take it on Echo? Well, the reason you take it on Echo is because if you can increase the speed in which you get your Proto Belt, then it completely changes the game, because Proto Belt as an item for Echo literally enables his entire kit. So you go from having a moderate amount of threat to a lot of threat, because then it's so easy for you to get into your EQ range and actually get onto them, rather than like just having to Q from a distance or that sort of thing. Like, they basically can never avoid your EQ combo as soon as you have Proto Belt active on as well. So you know, champions that are very, very item reliant, Futures Market is very useful. Minion Dematerializer. Start the game with 3 Dematerializers that kill and absorb lane minions instantly. Absorbing a minion increases your damage to that type of minion permanently by 6% and an extra 3% for each additional one absorbed. Now, very effective with champs that struggle to kill cannons. So there's a lot of different ways to use this specific rune. It's actually a very high skill cap rune and a very complex rune. So the first way to actually utilize this, and where it was actually utilized in the past, was that people used to take Minion Dematerializer to kill cannons, because cannons obviously take a long time to get through, especially within the early portion of the game. And because of how important tempo is as a concept, especially in the mid lane, where tempo resets lead to roam opportunities, lead to river control, lead to vision, lead to getting lane control, which leads to good trades, that sort of thing, people realize, well, you know, I can actually get a really good tempo reset because I can demat the actual cannon. Now, conversely, you know, then champs that couldn't kill cannons, like Malzahar, really became, you know, started taking them. Then, conversely, people realize, okay, if I want to actually increase my amount of wave clear, I can actually use Dematerializer on a certain amount of creeps to increase my wave clear potential. That's why you see it on champions like Echo and TF, where if you dematerialize the correct amount or correct ratio between the melee and the range creeps, it will give you the ability to shove and move when you wouldn't have been otherwise. Perfect example is Twisted Fate. Use all 3 on the range creeps. By the time you get Roa and Etherwisp, you can actually just one-shot the back 3 creeps. Conversely with Echo, you can one-shot the back 3 creeps at level 7 or whatever. So there's differing ways to utilize it. Some people like to utilize it on both the melees and the ranged to give you a certain amount of wave clear at a certain level. This is one of those things where you need to kind of talk to one tricks, experiment around in practice tool, that sort of thing. But note, guys, the only champions that you want to do that sort of strategy with are the ones that have a lot of AoE linear abilities. Like Echo Q and TFQ are very, very similar in that sense. You know, theoretically, it could work with a champion like Victor E, that sort of thing. I haven't actually tried it with Victor and the melees, but that could potentially be a thing. But again, you got to remember that people don't take this because of how strong Biscuit delivery is as well. So that's something you need to think about. For me personally, I still like taking it on champions like Galio and Malzahar, who really struggle to kill cannons. And lastly, it allows for tempo resets, like I said before. Now, Biscuit delivery. Gain a Biscuit every 2 minutes until 6 minutes. Biscuits restore 10% of missing HP and mana. Consuming or selling a Biscuit permanently increases mana cap by 50. If you are manaless, you get 12% missing HP instead. Now, very, very, very versatile rune, both as an aggressive and defensive one. Like I said before in this video, I talked about how resources you can't just view resources through a defensive lens. If you're in a heavy trading matchup where you're both 50% HP, one of you has Biscuits, one of you doesn't, the person that has the resource advantage on the next wave is most likely going to get push, which means that they might be able to get to that potential skirmish, which means that they might get that tempo reset, which means that they can come back, establish river control, that sort of thing. Like, the options are literally limitless if you have the resource advantage over your opponent. Or you can take a heavy trade that you wouldn't have been able to otherwise, knowing that you're going to have the resource advantage in the long run because of Biscuits. The other thing people don't even take into account as well is that it actually increases your max mana, and it still increases your max mana even if you sell them in base. So you can still, if you don't need to use them, you can hold on to them, sell them in base for 30 gold each, and then you still get that max mana as well. Now, They're also great for bullying your opponent, putting yourself in a position, you know, to take good trades or favorable reset, like I said before. But overall, this is probably one, again, similar to Nimbus Cloak. It's kind of one of those flavor of the season runes that people realize, holy crap, this is so versatile offensively and defensively, and it gives me so many opportunities to just like create favorable situations. And as we all know in League of Legends, I talk about this all the time, is it's all the small details that add up to create favorable situations. So you take this good trade, you get a resource advantage, which leads to the tempo reset, which gives you to come back and put your pink wards somewhere, or even you sell them, which gives you the amount of gold to get a pink ward, which creates a potential kill or gank setup in the future. You don't know. Okay, so it's all about the small things, and it's literally the definition of like a small wins rune. Why a lot of people love it as well. Now, Cosmic Insight, guys. 5% CDR, 5% max CDR, 5% summoner spell CDR, and 5% item CDR. It's a good fill rune, really covers all bases. It's great for when you really want to start Doran's Ring in lane over Corrupting Pot and really take the lane slower in like less heavy trading matchups. It's quite effective with champs that want constant access to summoner spells, especially champions like Orianna that are so immobile and they really want access to their flash. And it's also great for glacial users because, you know, combined with Ingenious Hunter, you get that extra, you get the CDR, the item CDR, that sort of thing. And also it actually synergizes decently with Transcendence as well. So approach velocity, gain 7.5 MS towards nearby enemy champions that are movement speed impaired. This bonus is increased to 15% for enemy champs that you impair. Again, we don't really see this rune too often because of how effective its counterparts are. And it's a very niche rune, but generally it's seen in the bot lane. It is sometimes seen in top lane, and the reason it isn't seen in mid lane often is because of how short the lane is. It's very rare that you're in a situation that you need to chase your enemy down over a long distance. Usually, well, bot lane and top lane comparatively are very long lanes, so you can see a potential argument to be made for taking it. So that is why it's mainly taken as supports or some AD carries like Ashe, something like that, so it can actually generate kill threat through a long lane. So it is very useful for chasing down enemies that are impaired, but like I said, that situation is so rare as a mid laner due to how short the lane is. Now, Time Warp Tonic here, guys. Consuming a potion or biscuit grants 50% of its health or mana restoration immediately, but puts the consumable on a short cooldown. Also gain 5% MS while using it. Now, guys, this would have to be one of the most misunderstood runes in the entire game, and one of my personal favorite runes that I always recommend it, but people don't understand why. So I want to settle it once and for all and really talk to you about what makes this rune so incredibly powerful in my opinion. Even though right now I have been leaning towards Cosmic Insight because of I do like starting Doran's right now on champions like Orianna, but it is very, very important to understand how this specific rune works. So let's just say you are in a matchup where, you know, it's deep in the lane. Both of you actually started with Corrupting Pot, but I'm playing Orianna and I took Time Warp, and they're playing Victor and they don't have Time Warp. Now, as the way it's crashing, we're both 50% HP. I decide to pop my Corrupting Pot, and so do they. Now, because I have Time Warp Tonic and I get 50% of its health or mana restoration immediately, that's actually going to allow me to potentially get pressure or get push off that wave, knowing that I'm much stronger than him then. Or if a 2v2 skirmish breaks out, I'm going to be able to get there first or have the resource advantage, which may turn the tides of that skirmish. As you can see here, this is just one little situation where, yes, I'm stronger and the resource advantage may lead to a tempo reset, whatever. But when it comes to skirmishes, when it comes to the entire laning phase, where every single wave where I'm going to have the resource advantage over the enemy, it can be incredibly powerful. And then on top of that, guys, if I am, again, we're both really low, I might need just enough HP just to get the wave out, or maybe it gives me just enough HP not to feel threatened by the enemy jungle so I can safely get the wave out without dying. I don't know. It's one of those very high tempo, fast paced runes that really increase the chances of either getting to a skirmish with higher resources than your opponent, either get the tempo reset off a wave, or even just bully the opponent off a wave and force them to recall and miss CS potentially. Or, especially if you're playing an aggressive champion like Echo with Ignites, you're just pushing the pace of the game so incredibly fast, it actually allows you to create kill threat a lot of the time. And people also don't talk about the bonus MS. If you're playing any of these champions that really rely on closing the gap, this is why it's so good on Echo as well. That bonus MS can literally be the difference between you getting in range to use that E or not. So it's in all these. It's one of those small, again, small wins runes where if you don't understand its strength and you're not really trying to push the pace of the game, its effects or its strength won't really, you won't really understand it, or you won't really feel it. So I would say I guess at a very beginner level, because the game isn't played to a fast pace in low elo, then I would probably recommend just Cosmic Insight, because it's just ease of execution. But as you get high elo, you'll really understand and feel the strength of this specific rune. And I really encourage you guys to kind of push your limits and watch VODs. You'll watch VODs and high elo games. That's why in Korea, so many Zoe players, instead of going secondary sorcery, the highest ranked Zoe player in Korea always goes Time Warp Tonic with Clumsy Bot, basically. Or a lot of the high elo Korean solo queue players always go Time Warp Tonic, because they're playing in those fast paced games where that tempo reset or that skirmish, that little advantage can literally mean life or death. So that's all for the runes, guys. So I know there's a lot of information there. If you have any questions about the runes specifically, anything like that, feel free to drop a comment below. But for now, there's a few more things that we need to cover. So now I want to talk about a few common rune mistakes. So these are the rune mistakes that I've seen upon all of my OPGG reviews or my coaching sessions at a range of differing elos. And I think these are the notable ones that I think you guys will get a lot of value from if you can implement these quick changes from these tips. So the first one, guys, is I see a lot of people take Conqueror on range champions, especially Cassiopeia. Now, yes, okay, the great thing about Conqueror with Cassiopeia is that you get access to Presence of Mind, but I feel like Cassiopeia is not really going to be getting those early solo kills anyway, and they're completely undervaluing the reliability of Phase Rush as a rune choice, both offensively and defensively. In my opinion, Cassiopeia has plenty of damage within her kit. Okay, she has plenty of damage within her kit. She doesn't really need more damage. I believe she needs more utility and more durability in terms of navigating those team fights, because she's so immobile. Phase Rush, in my opinion, allows you to take shorter trades, chase the enemy better, and even play defensively, self-peel, reposition without having to use your flash. Yes, again, you miss out on Presence of Mind, but you still build Seraphs, you still have Mana Flow Band, that sort of thing. It's just a lot more reliable. And if anything, actually, you get more mana in the early game with Mana Flow Band anyway. So, I don't know, man. Like, this, for me, unless you are in a specific matchup where you don't need the self-peel at all, you're in a very obvious melee, like range versus melee matchup, low threat team composition where you get a lot of value from Conqueror, majority of the time you're going to get, I said 90% of the time, you're going to get more value from taking Phase Rush. So that's just my take on it. And unless you're, I guess, if you're a high elo Cassiopeia player who mechanically knows exactly what to do, you're like a master tier, a grandmaster, then yes, Conqueror can be decent. But I would say for 90% of Cassiopeia players in like lower elo, Phase Rush will help you out big time. Number 2, taking Cheap Shot, which has a 4-second cooldown, like I mentioned in the domination tree, with high cooldown champions, and straight up undervaluing Taste of Blood. Now, one of my pet peeves is Electrocute Ahri players taking Cheap Shot. Like, I think Cheap Shot on Ahri is, especially Electrocute Ahri, is so, like, such a waste. Because if you think about it, how many times are you actually going to be landing your charm on the opponent in the early laning phase? Barely at all. And think about how many times you could be proccing Taste of Blood. If you have that small wins mindset and want to create favorable situations for yourself, Taste of Blood is going to be way better off for you. So stop taking Cheap Shot. It's a very noob rune. You're going to get a lot more value from Taste of Blood unless you're literally reliably proccing it, or you're taking Glacial, then I can probably see it. But you're just not. That's just not the case, guys. It's a 4-second cooldown for a reason. Number 3, taking Phase Rush over Arcane Comet or Aryan low elo. If you're low elo, I would say like silver and bronze and iron, then I would never be taking Phase Rush. I'd pretty much only be taking Arcane Comet or Airy. Undervaluing the max, and the reason, just to expand on that, Phase Rush is a very high skill cap rune, and a lot of people aren't going to be closing the gap and punishing you anyway, so having the free poke and the lane poke is just going to be a lot harder for people to deal with. Undervaluing the max mana increase with Biscuit Delivery. People don't understand, or they're not utilizing how important this specific rune is, and undervaluing the flexibility of the usage of this rune, because again, like I said, offensively and defensively, it's amazing. Similar to Time Warp Tonic, it's great for a fast-paced game, it's great if you're getting poked, it's great if you don't even use that at all, you can still sell it and still get the max mana as well. Really, really solid rune. Taking Perfect Timing over Magical Footwear when because they don't really understand the value of magical footwear in terms of saving the 300 gold, or they're taking magical footwear in matchups where they really need the tier 1 boots in the early game when they're versing a very high skill shot oriented matchup. I see that way too often, because a lot of the time their default response is, I see Zed, I see talent, I need stopwatch, so I go perfect timing, which is just not the case. I'd rather save the gold, get the Seekers, that sort of thing, and I talk about that within the inspiration tree. Taking Scorch on champs or in matchups when they can't reliably proc it, or conversely, taking Gathering Storm in matchups where it can be procced reliably. I say this way too much. If people they take Scorch, but they play like a bitch and they just sit back, relax, and want to scale to their first item. Don't do that. If you want to sit back, relax, play to your key spikes, and just minimize the early landing phase, go Gathering Storm. Or maybe you're playing in a matchup where you get completely outranged and you're never going to proc it anyway. And conversely, you're taking Gathering Storm but playing super aggressive. Both of them don't really make sense. This is why you need to have make a conscious effort to think about how are you actually going to navigate that lane, and how are you going to make the maximum amount of, how are you going to effectively use your runes to play out that lane in that specific way. See some really interesting stuff. Number 7, defaulting to bone plating when second wind would give you so much more sustain. Again, I talk about this within the resolve tree, but so many people default to bone plating because they just see it on a rune page or in pro guides or pro builds or whatever, and they don't realize that if you're in a poke matchup, second wind would give you infinitely more sustain. Unless you're versing a burst oriented matchup, then bone plating is not that good. Defaulting to eyeball collection, even though they're in a matchup where they get pressure and they could theoretically use Ghost Pro to a much better extent and get a lot more value because, again, the utility function of it as well. Not taking Legend Tenacity when you're versing heavy CC. That's a really common one, actually. And my biggest pet peeve, undervaluing, like I said before, the effectiveness of Time Warp Tonic. It can literally give you free tempo bases, and the movement speed is really, really underutilized, especially when you're playing any champion that really wants to close the gap or struggles to close the gap. Number 11 here, defaulting to double adaptive force in runes and not utilizing 1-time row of attack speed. What I've realized, I don't know the math behind this, but what 1 row of attack speed does, especially when playing mages like Victor or Orianna or even Twisted Fate, what it can actually do is it saves you having to use abilities on the wave. And especially in the early game, your mana cost is so high, and as we know, playing a mage, it feels so much better having push, because then you're not having to use your abilities on the wave, auto attacks on the wave, you can actually use it on the enemy. So when I take one row of attack speed, I feel I have a lot more wave control, which leads to me actually getting a lot more poke down on the enemy, or getting more vision out and being able to lean to one side. So it's a very good way of getting early priority when you wouldn't have otherwise. Or if you're versing a very heavy wave clear matchup, we're versing like a Zereth or a Vel'Koz or whatever, who's constantly trying to push you in, or a Galio, 1 row of attack speed can literally be the difference between you having to catch waves under tower or not. Very, very useful. I think this is the last one here. People not considering taking CDR in the first row, especially when taking Transcendence for the extra adaptive force. Not many people take CDR in the first row, especially as well. Another thing as well, people don't take CDR in the first row even though they barely build CDR within their kit. So this is why as well on champions like Cassiopeia, CDR is so incredibly important, because you want to be going Seras, which yes gives you CDR, but then after that, your entire 2 items are Rylai's and Liandry's, which gives you 0 CDR. And because CDR is such an important stat for Cassiopeia, this is where you got to think. It's like, okay, here I should actually probably take CDR. It's similar to Kassadin, where you want to build Roa, and then you build Archangel, so you don't really get much CDR for a very long time in the game. So now I just want to quickly talk about adapting rune pages, guys. So what I'm actually going to do is talk over 2 specific examples where I'm playing Orianna with a differing jungle against a differing mid jungle. So I'm going to break down row by row how I would think about adapting rune pages. So let's just say theoretically I'm playing Orianna, I have a Zac jungle, and I'm versing a Victor Kayn on the enemy team. Now what do we know? Yes, okay, Zac does have decent kill threat into a Victor because Victor's an immobile mage, but because Kayn does quite well into Zac, and you know, Zac doesn't have great early ganks, he probably needs to farm to at least level 6, that sort of thing, because of how low the E range is. I don't really see any chaotic fights happening. I don't see any early ganks being set up. I know this is most likely going to be a scaling lane, as well as Orianna can't overly punish Victor because of the range, how good Victor's range is well, because Victor can easily just take comment and poke me, that sort of thing. So the way I'm viewing it is, okay, this game's probably going to be quite slow, so I'm actually going to opt in for Phase Rush over something like Aerial Comet. Now, conversely, maybe I was versing more of like an aggressive laner or a low range laner where I could reliably proc Airy, then I'd go Airy. But Victor's high range. So yes, I could theoretically go Comet, but again, I think the self-peel aspect from Kayn with Phase Rush, given that he has slows in his kit, especially, you know, if he goes Blue Kayn, that sort of thing, then Phase Rush will be quite helpful. Now, next row here, Nimbus Cloak, I don't get really much value here. Mana Flow is just a really great option for Orianna. Transcendence, again, I'm going to get no value from these two. I'm going to be quite low. It's very rare that I'm going to be sitting or wanting to push the pace of this early game anyway, so I don't need absolute focus. I'm not going to be in Rivog, have many movement speed buffs anyway. Yes, I have my W, but it just doesn't give me nearly as much as Transcendence would. And since CDR is such an important stat for Orianna, I'm always going to go Transcendence. Then on the last row here, Gathering Storm, because again, I don't need to push the pace of this game in the early game, and Zac can't really complement that anyway. I highly doubt there's going to be River Skirmish 2v2s, so I just want the scaling from Gathering Storm. Now, secondary. The great thing about these two is, okay, again, since it's scaling, I want to get to my Lost Chapter. Magical Footwear is going to really help me. Yes, there is an argument to be made that I could potentially take something else like Cosmic Insight and then buy early tier 1 boots to potentially help dodge Victor's E. But I would just much rather that scaling for me and save that extra gold, because Victor's quite a, I guess, a poke heavy matchup as well. Biscuits gives me a lot of flexibility if he decides not to. If he decides to do it, I don't know. Biscuits overall is just going to give me so much flexibility in my approach. Now, yes, I could conversely have gone Domination, or maybe Taste of Blood, Ravenous Hunter or something like that, but I just feel like the Biscuits and the Magical Footwear allow me to get to my spikes more reliably, and give me a little bit more freedom within the early game, because I already am going heavy scaling in my primary tree here, and Ravenous Hunter very much is a heavy scaling mid to late game rune. Now, I don't feel I need Time Warp Tonic, because I don't think this is going to be an insanely fast lane. I mean, it could be. I mean, this guy could go Comet and push the lane, but given the jungle matchup, I'd rather just take Doran's, have the extra durability, and play the lane a little bit slower. Plus, I get sustained from here anyway. Now, here, I really personally like attack speed on Orianna versus Victor, because Orianna, I mean, Victor doesn't deal well with getting shoved in, and I want to minimize the amount of mana I have to use on the wave, so I can focus my poke on the Victor rather than focusing my poke on the wave, or using my mana to thin the wave. So that's actually something I think about here. The rest is pretty self-explanatory. Now let's contrast this with this one, where Orianna Lee Sin versus Qiyana release. Now this is going to be a very heavy mid-jungle matchup and very quite aggressive. So here I actually decided to go Airy, because Phase Rush I feel like is not going to give me too much value, because I feel like if I'm going to get hit by anything, I'm going to die anyway, so I might as well all in on that early aggressive lane, take heaps of decent trades, because I can actually bully Qiyana very well pre-6. So I actually go for Airy, and because it's a low range champion, I can actually proc Airy a lot with auto attacks and Qs. I go Mana Flow Band to complement my early trading with that mana. I could have actually gone Absolute Focus here, but I think that's a little bit overkill. I'd rather the Transcendence here. Round that off with Scorch, that synergizes very well with Airy here. I'm pushing the pace of the game. And then conversely, on the other side, instead of going Magical Footwear, I know this is going to be a very early lane-centric, potentially heavy trading matchup, because Qiyana will start trading on me at level 3, in which I will go Biscuits and Time Warp Tonic with Corrupting Pot start to really push the pace of the game. Heavy trade, that sort of thing. Probably base for an early Dark Seal, Cloth Armor, that sort of thing. And then again, I want a little bit more lane control, minimize the amount of abilities I want to use on the wave, so I can just auto attack the waves. I have Armor here, Adaptive Force, that sort of thing. Yes, some Oriannas like to go Domination, but I just feel like I need that access to Time Warp. I need the access to Biscuits. Some also like Presence of Mind. I just don't think Presence of Mind makes sense in this thing. I feel like Presence of Mind is overkill now, especially since you go tier on Orianna anyway. And then Resolve feels overkill as well, because I'm all inning on those early trades. I would rather just really punish this Qiyana. My offense being my defense in a way. So hopefully that that really makes sense in terms of breaking down what it means to I guess adapt your early or your runes when heading into a game. So thanks for watching, everyone. I know this is a very long video. I don't expect you to digest all of this information in one hit. Navigate to the section that interests you, or the runes that you really want to understand more about. I will be putting out part 2 about itemization very soon, so stay tuned. Appreciate the support, guys. Cheers.